Hello story enthusiasts. Welcome to Eclipse Wizardry. Today we venture into, what if Daphne's soul brand appeared on Harry age 9 and ancient magic burned away every Veela claim. Your support means everything. Like and subscribe. Enjoy. Chapter 1. The mark that burned without fire. The cupboard under the stairs at number 4 Privet Drive was exactly 31 inches wide at its widest point. Harry knew because he had measured it with a ruler he found behind the water heater, pressing the cold metal against the wall while Aunt Petunia's footsteps creaked overhead. 31 inches. He had written that number on the inside of his pillowcase with a ballpoint pen that was almost out of ink, along with other measurements: ceiling height, floor length, the precise distance from his cot to the door that locked from the outside. He didn't know why he measured things. It just felt better to know the exact shape of the world around him than to guess. He was 9 years old and already very good at being still and quiet and invisible. Tonight the house was sleeping. Uncle Vernon's snoring rattled through the ceiling like a steam engine with a fault. Dudley had gone to bed early for once, too stuffed with birthday cake to cause any damage, and Aunt Petunia had taken 2 of her little white tablets with warm milk and closed the bedroom door with the careful precision of a woman who had decided the day was over and intended to enforce that decision. Harry had eaten half a piece of bread with margarine for dinner. He would have been allowed more, but Dudley had knocked his plate off the table on purpose and laughed while it shattered, and nobody had told Dudley to stop. That was fine. Harry had learned to not be hungry in a very thorough way, the way you learn to stop expecting a train that never comes to your station. He lay on his cot with his eyes open. Through the thin gap under the cupboard door he could see the faint orange streetlight bleeding across the hallway floor tiles, and he was watching a spider build a web in the corner near the water heater, industrious and completely unbothered by the fact that this was not a good location for catching flies. Then his arm burned. Not like he had touched the stove. Not like the time Aunt Petunia had grabbed him by the wrist hard enough to leave a bracelet of yellow bruises. This was different. It started somewhere deeper than skin, like someone had lit a small candle in the middle of his forearm and the heat was traveling outward through his bones. He sat up fast, cracking his head on the low shelf above his cot, biting down hard on a sound that would have woken the house. He pressed his back against the wall and looked at his arm in the streetlight orange dark. The inside of his left forearm was glowing. Not brightly. Not like a torch or a flame. It was more like watching light move underwater, a slow pulse that followed the shape of something he couldn't quite see yet, like the outline of a figure traced in warm amber. He pressed his right hand over it instinctively, and the heat jumped through his palm like a living thing, ran up his arm, settled somewhere in the center of his chest and stayed there. Warm. Harry had not been warm, genuinely, bone-deep warm, in longer than he could clearly remember. He should have been frightened. He examined the idea of being frightened from several angles, the way he had learned to examine most things, and found that what he actually felt was something else entirely. He felt, in a way he absolutely could not have articulated at age 9, recognized. Like something enormous and very old had looked at him, specifically at him, Harry Potter, who measured his cupboard with a stolen ruler and had no friends and ate margarine on bread for dinner, and had said, yes. This one. Here. He stayed awake for a long time watching the glow fade to a pale mark on his skin, a design he couldn't quite make out in the dark but could feel with his fingertips, raised slightly, like a scar that had been there forever and he simply hadn't noticed until now. Eventually he slept. In the morning he wore a long-sleeved school shirt even though it was June. 2 years later, in a manor house in Wiltshire that smelled of old books and wood smoke, Daphne Greengrass sat across from her mother at the breakfast table and ate her toast with the precise, controlled movements of a girl who had already decided exactly how much of herself she was prepared to share with any given morning. She was 11. She had received her Hogwarts letter 3 weeks ago. She had read it twice, set it down on her writing desk with the corner perfectly aligned to the desk's edge, and then sat very quietly for 20 minutes thinking about what it meant. What it meant, she had concluded, was that the next chapter was beginning. Her mother, Cecilia Greengrass, was reading correspondence and occasionally making small sounds of social consideration. Her younger sister Astoria was still upstairs asleep, because Astoria slept like a creature that had made a formal commitment to unconsciousness and intended to honor it past all reasonable morning hours. Their father was in London for the week on business that Daphne knew better than to ask about in detail. "You'll need to think about where you'll sit on the train," her mother said, not looking up from her letters. Daphne took a precise bite of toast. "I've been thinking about it. Pansy Parkinson's mother has written to say that Pansy would like to sit with you." Daphne considered this. Pansy Parkinson was shrewd and social and exhausting and would be useful. "All right. And you've thought about the sorting?" "I'll be in Slytherin." Her mother finally looked up. Not surprised, Cecilia Greengrass had not been surprised by her eldest daughter in approximately 4 years, and had adjusted her expectations accordingly. "You sound very certain." "I am." The brand on her own arm had appeared 2 years ago, the same night she had woken up at 3 in the morning with the sensation of warmth flooding through her chest from a source she couldn't identify, like someone had reached through the dark from very far away and placed their hand over her heart. She had not told anyone. She had gone to the family library the following day and worked methodically through the restricted section, which she could reach by standing on her father's reading chair, and had found 3 references to Soul brands in texts old enough that the ink had faded to brown. What she had found had not frightened her. What had frightened her, a little, was the warmth. It was still there. Faint, like a pilot light in the center of her chest. She had spent 2 years learning to ignore it with the same discipline she applied to everything else, and she was almost entirely successful, except occasionally at night when she was almost asleep and her defenses were down and she could feel, distantly, someone else breathing in the dark. Someone alive. Someone real. Someone who, she was increasingly certain, had no idea she existed. Daphne ate her toast. Outside the manor windows the Wiltshire morning was grey and soft. She was ready for Hogwarts. She was ready for whatever came next. The Hogwarts Express left King's Cross at 11 in the morning and Harry spent the first 20 minutes of the journey sitting in a compartment with Ron Weasley, whose family had basically dragged him through the barrier between platforms 9 and 10 when they saw him standing there looking baffled with his trolley and his owl, and a girl named Hermione Granger who had come in looking for a lost toad and then simply stayed, apparently deciding that this was as good a compartment as any. They ate sweets from the trolley and Ron explained about Quidditch with the evangelical energy of someone sharing a religion, and Hermione told them both about the books she had read in preparation for Hogwarts with the systematic thoroughness of a military briefing, and Harry listened to both of them with genuine interest because he had spent 10 years with people who treated him like furniture and the novelty of being spoken to like a person had not yet worn off. He had not shown anyone the brand on his arm. He wore his school robes and underneath them his shirt sleeves were long. The mark was faint now, had been faint for 2 years, but warm still, always warm, a constant small ember that he had gotten so used to that he noticed it more when it flickered unexpectedly than when it simply sat there doing its quiet thing. It flickered once on the train, somewhere around Birmingham. Sharp and sudden, like someone had poked the pilot light. He pressed his right hand over it through his robe and the warmth settled, and he looked out the window at the darkening countryside and thought nothing in particular about it. The sorting happened and Hermione went to Gryffindor looking triumphant and slightly relieved, and Ron went to Gryffindor looking like a boy who had never seriously considered any alternative, and Harry stood before the whole school with the sorting hat on his head and the hat whispered things in his ear that made his pulse kick. Plenty of courage, yes, and a mind sharper than people have bothered to notice, and something older in you. Something the school hasn't seen in quite some time, and then declared Gryffindor to considerable noise, and Harry walked to the red and gold table feeling the eyes of the whole hall on him and sitting down and thinking, clearly and simply, all right. This is where I start. He noticed the Slytherin table because it was across the hall and he was at the age where he noticed everything. A girl with pale blonde hair and excellent posture had her eyes on him when he looked across, not staring, not the wide-eyed celebrity stare he had been getting all evening, more like she was confirming something she had already suspected. Their eyes met for exactly 1 second. Then she looked away, and her face gave absolutely nothing back, and Harry looked away too and ate his food. He didn't think about it again for 3 weeks. 3 weeks into the term, a Tuesday, Transfiguration at 9 in the morning. Harry was good at Transfiguration in a way that McGonagall clearly hadn't expected, and he was starting to understand that she showed approval through incremental relaxation of her mouth, which went from firmly sealed to a nearly imperceptible line of acknowledgement when he did something correctly. He had transfigured his match to a needle in under a minute in the first class. She had looked at him with the expression of a woman revising a document. After Transfiguration was a free period, which Harry was using to go to the library because Hermione had mentioned a book about foundational charms theory and he had become, somewhat to his own surprise, genuinely interested in knowing how things worked. Not just the spells but the architecture underneath them. Why spells worked. What magic actually was at its base level. This, he would later understand, was the first sign of the thing in him that the Sorting Hat had noticed. The library was on the 3rd floor and mostly empty at this hour. He found the Charms Theory book. Hermione had already gotten there first, based on the bookmark and the marginalia, and took it to a table near the window that looked out over the grounds, where the morning light came in at a useful angle. He had been reading for about 20 minutes when the brand on his arm went from warm to hot. Not painful. Still not painful. In 2 years it had never hurt, not once. But this was more than the quiet pilot light warmth. This was the candle becoming a lamp, sudden and bright and insistent, and he pressed his hand over his forearm automatically and looked up. The girl from the Slytherin table was standing 6 feet away with a book under her arm and her eyes on him. Not in a warm way. In the way you look at an equation that is refusing to resolve. She was quite pretty in a cold, architectural way. Harry thought this in a completely 11-year-old fashion, meaning he noted it the way he noted that something was well made without knowing anything about why. Her hair was light blonde, nearly silver in the library light, and her robes were perfectly pressed, and she was watching his hand pressed against his forearm with an expression that had fractured very slightly from its usual perfect composure. The warmth in his arm was steady and strong and pulling slightly, like a tide. "You feel it too," she said. It wasn't a question. Harry kept his hand where it was. He looked at her. He had always been very good at staying still and quiet, and he was doing that now, not from fear but from the instinct that told him this was a moment that required care. "Feel what?" She crossed the remaining distance between them in 3 precise steps, set her book on the table, and pushed up the left sleeve of her robes. The mark on her forearm was a mirror of his. The same design, which he had studied in the dark with his fingertips for 2 years and could now see clearly in the library light for the first time on someone else's skin, a complex interlaced pattern, something between a compass and a flame, something that looked old in the way that standing stones look old, the way things look when they've been here longer than the people naming them. Hers was slightly darker than his, or maybe lighter. They were both the same warm amber color, but against her pale skin it looked like a coal at its hottest point. "Oh," Harry said. "Yes." She pulled her sleeve down. "I've been trying to identify you since the sorting, and it took this long because you keep your arm covered." "So do you." "Obviously." She sat down across from him, straight-backed, not like she was being formal but like a straight back was simply her natural state. "My name is Daphne Greengrass." "Harry Potter." "I know who you are." Not cruel about it, just factual. "What do you know about what this is?" Harry considered lying or being vague, and decided against it. She clearly knew something. And she had found him first, which meant she was more organized about this than he was. He had been 9 when it appeared and had been working with very limited library access in a house that contained no books about magic because the Dursleys did not acknowledge that magic was real. "Not much," he said honestly. "I know it appeared when I was 9. I know it's warm. I know it doesn't hurt. I tried to find information about it in the school library the second week of term and got absolutely nowhere." Something in her face shifted, not softened exactly, but recalibrated. Like she had prepared for a different version of this conversation and was adjusting. I found 3 references in my family's restricted texts. A soul brand is ancient magic. Not the kind that humans cast, the kind that exists before and underneath human magic. It identifies 2 people as, she paused. The texts used different language. Counterparts. Equals. The translations aren't precise. What does it actually do? From what I've gathered, it recognizes each other. It responds to magical attempts to influence or bind either person that come from outside the bond. She was watching him carefully now. There's a theoretical implication that it protects. That it burns away anything attempting to interfere with. She stopped again, and the pause was longer this time. With the 2 people it marked, Harry finished. Yes. They looked at each other across the library table. Outside the window, the grounds were November gray and bare-treed. Somewhere in the library stacks, somebody dropped a book with a sound like a small explosion. "All right," Harry said. He pulled up his own sleeve and looked at the mark in the light, properly, for the first time in front of another person. "We should probably find out more." Daphne looked at his arm. He had the distinct impression this was something she had been imagining doing for 2 years, not in a warm way, in the way a researcher imagines getting access to a primary source. Then she looked back up at his face with those composed gray eyes, and for just a fraction of a second, before the composure reassembled, he saw something in her that was not cold at all. "We should," she said. "But we should be careful about who else finds out." "Why?" "Because you're you," she said, simply, "and I'm in Slytherin, and what's on our arms is something old enough that the school doesn't have proper documentation for it, which means the moment adults find out about it, everyone will want to control what it means." She held his gaze. "And I don't let people control things that are mine." "Agreed," he said. Daphne nodded once. She picked up her book, stood, and was 3 steps away before she turned back. "Same time Thursday?" "I've requested a book through the interlibrary exchange that should arrive by then." Harry almost smiled. "You're very organized." "Someone has to be." She looked at his arm one more time, just briefly, just for a second, and then she was walking away between the stacks, her robes perfectly straight, and the warmth in Harry's arm settled back to its normal pilot-light hum, steady and consistent and there. He went back to his charms theory book. But he was thinking about compass and flame marks and the word counterparts and the specific quality of the look on Daphne Greengrass's face in the moment before her composure came back up. This one. Here. The ancient magic, he was beginning to think, had been paying very close attention. The thing about Hogwarts was that it was enormous and full of people and therefore full of events, and events had a way of overrunning the careful schedules you tried to maintain. The Veela incident, which is what Harry would call it later, privately, in his own head, because it needed a name, happened on a Friday morning 3 days after the library conversation, before he and Daphne had managed to meet again. He had been walking to Charms with Ron and Hermione, discussing whether or not Peeves qualified as a person under wizarding law. Ron said no, Hermione said the question was more complex than that and was warming up to what was clearly going to be a thorough argument, when something happened in his arm. Not the warm flicker. Not the steady pilot light. Something entirely different. Something cold and external and wrong, like a hand reaching into his chest from outside and trying to rearrange the furniture. He stopped walking. Ron and Hermione continued for 2 more steps before they noticed. "Harry?" Ron turned around. "You've gone dead white." The sensation was intensifying. It was coming from, he looked around, trying to identify it, and his eyes landed on a group of third-year girls walking in the opposite direction. One of them was strikingly, almost painfully beautiful in the way that made you think there was something biological happening, something below the level of preference or taste, silvery hair, and a quality of presence that pushed at the edges of your attention and demanded it. She wasn't doing anything. She was just walking and talking to her friends. But something was emanating from her, directed forward through the hall in a broad wave, and it had passed over Harry the way a wave passes over a rock, and now, the brand on his arm went incandescent. Not visibly, it was under his sleeve, but Harry felt it the way you feel a shout in a quiet room. A surge of warmth so powerful it nearly knocked him sideways, burning outward from his forearm through his chest and up the back of his neck, and the cold external sensation, the hand rearranging furniture, simply evaporated. Gone. Dissolved. Like it had never been. And in its wake, where the foreign feeling had been pressing, he felt absolutely nothing about the third-year girl at all. She was just a girl walking in a corridor, pretty in an ordinary way, talking to her friends. Then the backlash hit. It moved outward from him like a concussive wave, not physically, but magically, something that everyone nearby felt rather than heard, a shimmer in the air like heat haze over summer pavement, and every person in the corridor within 20 feet stumbled. Harry stumbled. The girl with the silvery hair stumbled and looked up with wide, startled eyes. Ron sat down hard on the stone floor, looking bewildered. Hermione grabbed the wall. And at the far end of the corridor, Daphne Greengrass, who had apparently been heading in the opposite direction, braced against the localized magical shockwave with the expression of someone who had felt this before from the inside and was processing it in real time. Their eyes met across 20 feet of stunned corridor. Her composure was all the way down. Just for a second, just in the aftermath of the burn, the Ice Queen of Slytherin was standing in a school hallway looking at a Gryffindor boy with something that was not academic interest and was not coldness and was not calculation. It was recognition, raw and involuntary and nothing like what she had shown him in the library. Then it was back up. The Ice Queen reassembled like a shutter closing. She turned to the girl beside her, Pansy Parkinson, who was staring at Harry with an expression divided between curiosity and social alarm, and said something quietly. Pansy looked at Harry. Looked at Daphne. Made a face that suggested she was filing this information away for later processing. Daphne walked away toward the dungeons without looking back. The silvery-haired third-year girl was staring at Harry with an expression he couldn't read. Her friends were clustering around her, checking on her, asking questions in urgent whispers. She looked, not frightened, exactly. More like someone whose magic had been redirected mid-cast and was working out what that meant. What, Ron said from the floor, was that? I don't know, Harry said, which was technically true and also completely false. Hermione had her wand out. She was looking at the air where the shimmer had been, at the residue of something that had happened and left traces. Her eyes went to Harry. He knew that expression. That was her "I have about 40 questions and I'm going to ask them systematically" expression. Later, Harry said, before she could begin. She closed her mouth. Put her wand away. Looked at the corridor, at the residue, at Harry. Later, she agreed, and her voice said clearly that later was not optional and would be arriving very soon. Harry's arm was back to its normal warmth. The cold foreign thing was gone as completely as if it had been erased, and in its place was only the steady pulse of the brand, unchanged, untroubled, warm as a candle in a cupped hand. He walked to Charms with his jaw set and his sleeves down and his mind moving very fast through everything Daphne had told him in the library. It burns away anything attempting to interfere with the two people it marked. Whatever that silvery-haired girl had been carrying, and he was increasingly certain she hadn't known she was carrying it, that it was ambient, inherited, some Veela inheritance in the bloodline working its quiet compulsory magic on the world around her, the brand had not tolerated it for 1 second. Had not weighed it, considered it, tried to coexist with it. Had simply identified it as foreign influence and burned it out of him with the effortless violence of a body burning away infection. In Charms, Professor Flitwick was teaching them the Wingardium Leviosa charm for the second time, and Harry levitated his feather to the ceiling and held it there and watched it and thought about what it meant to have something that old, that thorough, that absolute, standing between him and the things the world put in the air around him. After class, he waited in the corridor while Ron talked to Dean Thomas about something Quidditch-related, and Hermione materialized at his elbow with the punctuality of someone who had been timing this moment. The shimmer was magical backlash, she said, without preamble. Whatever repelled that was from you, Harry. Or on you. And it was very old, the residual signature was nothing like standard spell work. I've only read about signatures like that in 2 places and both of them were describing ancient magic, Harry said quietly. Hermione stared at him. Yes. How did you? I need you to find every book in the library on ancient magic, he said. Not just the theory sections. The histories. The restricted texts if you can get access. He met her eyes. And I need you to not tell anyone what you're looking for or why. Hermione processed this. He could see the competing impulses, the instinct to push for more information immediately, the rule-following concern about restricted texts, and underneath both of those, genuine worry about him that she expressed primarily through gathering information. The worry won. All right, she said. But you're going to explain everything. Not yet, he said. But soon. She looked like she wanted to argue. Then she looked at his face, at whatever his face was doing, the steadiness there, and instead she said, fine. But soon means soon, Harry. I know. He walked to his next class with the brand warm on his arm and Hermione's footsteps precise and slightly annoyed behind him, and in the dungeons, he was reasonably sure, Daphne Greengrass was sitting in potions and thinking through the same morning from a different angle, with the same brand on her arm and the same particular quality of controlled expression that was not coldness but looked exactly like it from the outside. Counterparts, the old texts had apparently said. Harry thought he was beginning to understand what that meant. Not equals in power only, though that was in there, he could feel it. But equals in the way of 2 people who looked at the world from different angles and somehow, between the 2 angles, got the full picture. She was organized and strategic and had been researching this for 2 years. He was instinctive and observant and had spent a decade learning to read rooms and intentions and the quality of silences. Together, they had started to figure it out in one library conversation. The ancient magic had known something. Had been paying attention, over a very long span of time, to the shape of things. And it had looked at 2 9-year-old children, a neglected boy in a cupboard and a composed girl in a manor library, and had said, with all the authority of something older than the school, older than the families, older than the names people put on power, yes. These 2. Here. Harry pressed his hand once against his forearm through his robe, felt the warm steady pulse, and went to class. Chapter 2, Ice and Old Fire. The library on Thursday had a smell that Harry was starting to associate with things being figured out, old paper and candle wax and the particular dustiness of books that had been waiting a long time to be useful. He arrived first, which he suspected was intentional on both their parts, and had been there long enough to spread 3 books across the table and look like he'd been studying productively when Daphne arrived at exactly the agreed time carrying a slim volume bound in dark green leather and wearing the expression of someone who had been thinking hard and continuously since Friday morning. She sat down. Put the book on the table. Looked at his 3 books, which were general magical theory texts and therefore mostly useless for their purposes, and then looked at him. The Beauxbatons girl, she said. Not a question. 3rd year. Part Veela bloodline, I think. The effect was ambient, not targeted. She wasn't doing it on purpose. I know. I spoke to Fleur Delacour after class. Daphne's voice was completely neutral. She was disturbed by what happened in the corridor. She said she'd felt her natural aura redirect, like it had hit something solid and bounced. A small pause. She's actually quite reasonable, which I wasn't expecting. Harry looked at her. You went and talked to her. I wanted to know if it was deliberate. Daphne sat down fully now, pulled the green leather book toward her. It wasn't. Her grandmother apparently worked a generalized favorable impression charm into the family line generations ago, the kind that smooths social interactions and makes people inclined toward Veela positively. It operates passively. She had no idea it had tried to settle on you, and she had no idea why it failed. What did you tell her? That you have an unusual magical signature that doesn't accept external influence. She opened the book with practiced care. Which is true and explains nothing and satisfied her enough that she'll leave it alone. Harry thought about the girl in the corridor, the wide startled eyes, the cluster of concerned friends, and felt something like relief that she hadn't been trying anything deliberately. That was well handled. Daphne's mouth made a tiny movement. Not quite a smile. Thank you. She turned the book to face him. This arrived from the family exchange Wednesday evening. It's a Greengrass family text, mid-15th century, my grandmother's notation in the margins. I want you to read the section I've marked. The pages she had bookmarked were dense with archaic script, but Harry had spent 2 years attempting to read books with no one helping him and had gotten quite good at decoding things through sheer dogged persistence. He pulled the book closer and read. The section was called, in translation that felt slightly approximate, The Recognition Marks of the Old Compact. The language was dense and occasionally strange. Whoever had written this had been working in a magical tradition that predated a lot of modern wizarding vocabulary, and the translator had filled the gaps with best-guess language. But the core of it came through. Soul brands, the text called them recognition marks, but the description was exact, were not created by human magic. They were the expression of what the text called the Old Compact, a self-organizing principle in magic itself that identified, across large spans of time and across magical bloodlines regardless of status or classification, two people whose combined magical natures were capable of something larger than either could access independently. The compact marked them. The marks recognized each other. And the marks, this was the part that made Harry sit forward, were adversarial to any magic that attempted to predetermine the relationship between the two marked individuals. Not just protective. Adversarial. Active. Designed to identify and destroy influence, compulsion, binding, or manipulation directed at either marked person, because the Old Compact's logic was this: the relationship between two recognition-marked individuals must develop entirely from their own choices, because the compact's purpose is only fulfilled if what grows between them is genuine. Daphne's grandmother's grandmother had written in the margin in tiny, cramped script, "This explains the Volkov incident of 1423. The marked pair destroyed the compulsion so thoroughly the caster lost their magic entirely. Do not attempt to influence the marked. The mark knows." Harry looked up from the book. Daphne was watching him with that composed expression that he was beginning to read around the edges of, the slight tension in her jaw that meant she was waiting for a reaction, and waiting with more personal investment than she was letting her face show. "It burned away the Veela aura," Harry said, "because the aura was trying to make me feel a certain way about someone who wasn't part of the bond." More specifically, Daphne said, "It burned it away because the aura was external magic attempting to influence your social and emotional responses. Which the brand treats as interference. Which it does not tolerate. And the backlash was, the brand burning out the influence. The shockwave was residual energy from a very thorough magical deletion." She paused. "Based on the Volkov notation, I believe we got off lightly. The 1423 incident apparently left the caster permanently depleted. Fleur is fine because she didn't cast it. It was inherited ambient, not active." Harry sat back. The library was quiet around them. Someone was shelving books 3 rows over, the soft repetitive thud of volumes being replaced. Morning light came through the high windows in angled shafts. "It's going to keep doing that," he said. "Isn't it?" "Presumably. Whenever something tries to influence either of us from outside." She folded her hands on the table. "You should know that the Slytherin social ecosystem operates partly through subtle influence magic. Not the overt kind, nothing that would register as a formal spell. The kind built into how certain families conduct social relations. Gift charm residue on objects. Presence enhancement potions in common spaces." Her voice was very even. "It's normal in certain circles. Most people don't notice because they've grown up in it." Harry understood what she was saying. The brand is going to react to all of that. I don't know if it will react to ambient low-level influence the way it reacted to the Veela aura. The Veela aura was apparently more direct. She glanced down at the text. But I would expect that anything deliberate, targeted, or of meaningful potency would get the same treatment. Is anyone going to try something deliberate and targeted? Daphne looked at him for a moment. There was something very dry in her expression. Harry. You're Harry Potter, and you're making friends across house lines on your first term. There are people in Slytherin who will decide that needs addressing. She tilted her head slightly. And you've now been seen having a visible magical event in the corridor that most of the upper years noticed. People will want to understand what happened. Some of them will want to test it. Let them, Harry said. She looked at him. The dryness in her expression shifted into something more careful, not concerned exactly, but attentive. You're very calm about this. I spent 10 years, Harry said, being told I wasn't allowed to be what I was. I had someone else's house, someone else's clothes, someone else's idea of who I was supposed to be. He kept his voice easy, not angry, just factual. Something that tells the rest of the world to keep their hands off what's mine doesn't strike me as a problem. It strikes me as the first thing in my life that was on my side. Daphne was very still. He had the sense that she was recalibrating again, that he kept saying things that didn't match the version of this conversation she had prepared for. After a moment, she said, quietly and without particular expression, yes. That's, yes. It was the least composed thing she had said to him. He decided not to acknowledge it directly because instinct told him that calling attention to her composure slipping would make her rebuild it faster and thicker. Instead he pulled the book back toward him. The text mentions the compact being fulfilled. What does that mean? What's it trying to accomplish? Daphne exhaled, just slightly. Back on analytical ground. The text is vague about the endpoint. Something larger than either could access independently, is the closest it gets to specific. My interpretation is that the compact identifies two people whose magics are complementary, not identical, but fitted. And whatever they can do together is the point of the whole thing. She looked down at her own arm, over her sleeve. We're 11. Whatever the compact is working toward is likely not immediate. But the brand is already active. Already reacting. The recognition is active. The protection is active. She met his eyes. The rest is presumably a matter of time and development and, she stopped. Choice, Harry said. The text did say it had to be genuine. They looked at each other across the library table, two 11-year-olds sitting with a 500-year-old family text between them and marks on their arms that the world had put there without asking, and the moment had a specific quality of weight that neither of them was quite equipped to name yet. So they didn't try. Right, Harry said. So we keep researching. We figure out more about what it can do. And we don't let anyone else tell us what it means. Agreed. Daphne reached out and turned the book back to face her, closing it with careful hands. And we are careful about who knows. Hermione's going to figure it out, Harry said. She's already looking for books on ancient magic and she won't stop until she's found everything the library has. Daphne absorbed this. Granger. Top of every class, never stops reading, will likely know more about this than either of us within a fortnight. That's her, yes. Can she be trusted to be discreet? Harry thought about Hermione, about the way she had looked at him in the corridor and said later and meant it, about how she gathered information like a fortress gathers walls, about the steadiness underneath all the bookishness and the rule-following. Yes, he said. She'll follow the evidence wherever it goes. If the evidence says be quiet, she'll be quiet. Daphne nodded slowly. All right. You can read her in. Carefully. She stood, tucking the green leather book under her arm. Same time next week. I'll have more by then. How many restricted family texts do you have access to? For the first time, a genuine small smile, there and gone, quick as a match flame, but real. More than is probably healthy for someone my age. She turned to go, and then turned back with the habit of someone who always has a final point. Harry. The people who will try to test the brand, don't warn them off. Let them try. He raised an eyebrow. Because every time the brand reacts, she said, we learn more about what it does. And the people who tried something end up more afraid of you than they were before. She looked completely serious and slightly dangerous. That's useful. She walked away between the stacks, and Harry sat for a moment looking at the space where she'd been, and then he laughed, quietly, to himself, the genuine surprised laughter of someone who has just met a mind that works in a way that delights them. The test came sooner than either of them expected. It was Sunday, 10 days after the corridor incident, and Harry was in the common room finishing an essay for history of magic when something settled over him like a cloak, a drowsy, unfocused feeling, like the room had gotten slightly warmer and the edges of things had softened. He looked up from his parchment. Around him the common room had a quality of general contentment, people relaxed into their chairs, voices quieter than usual, the kind of ease you sometimes got on late Sunday afternoons when the week felt far away. Harry recognized the feeling because it was identical to what he'd felt for about 4 seconds in the corridor before the brand had burned the Veela aura away. The same quality of external imposition, not his own feeling but something being pressed on him from outside, something that wanted him relaxed and unfocused and agreeable. He looked around the common room methodically and found the source in about 15 seconds. A fifth-year boy named Marcus Belby, who Harry knew slightly from the Quidditch tryout commentary he'd heard through the portrait hole last week, had his wand in his hand under the table and was murmuring something with the practiced ease of someone running a spell they'd cast many times. The spell was subtle, not the kind of thing the teachers would notice, not the kind of thing that would register on standard monitoring charms. The kind of thing that made a room of people feel gently compliant. Harry had never felt it before because he had not, before Hogwarts, spent time in enclosed spaces with people who had wands and reasons to use them quietly. He set down his quill. The brand burned it away with no theatrical shockwave this time, just a clean, immediate dissolution, like a cold flame. The drowsiness vanished. The edges of the room came back sharp and clear. And Harry felt the sensation he had felt in the corridor, the brand identifying something external and foreign and obliterating it without asking his permission, which he had, genuinely, no objection to. What was different this time was that he could tell it had worked. He could feel the absence where the spell had been. And he could feel the exact moment Marcus Belby's wand work hit resistance. Belby blinked. Murmured again. Hit resistance again. Harry watched him from across the room, not pretending to be looking elsewhere. He watched until Belby looked up and found Harry's eyes on him, and something moved through Belby's face, not guilt exactly, more like the recalibration of someone who expected the door to be unlocked and found it wasn't. Harry held his gaze. He didn't say anything. He didn't look angry or accusing or frightened. He just watched, steady and calm, until Belby put his wand away and stood up and left the common room with a studied casualness that didn't entirely work. Ron appeared at Harry's elbow from wherever Ron had been. What was that about? Nothing important, Harry said, and picked up his quill and went back to his essay. Ron looked at the portrait hole through which Belby had departed. He's in Flint's circle, Belby. Fourth-year Slytherin crowd, lots of. He made a vague gesture. Stuff going on in that corner of the castle. Harry filed this. Good to know. He wrote 3 more lines of essay and then, underneath the essay text, small enough that only he could read it, wrote, Brand works on deliberate targeted compliance spells too. Clean dissolution, no backlash this time, maybe because it was lower power. Note, being watched seems to break the caster's nerve. Remember this. Hermione appeared 20 minutes later from the direction of the girls' dormitory with a book under each arm and her hair in a particular state of intellectual excitement that Harry was learning to read as I found something. She sat down across from him, looked at him with her sharp brown eyes, looked at the door through which Belby had left, looked back at him. The restricted section, she said, keeping her voice low, requires a teacher's note, which I don't have, but the reference texts in the regular section cite several restricted volumes in their footnotes, and I've been following the citation chains, and Harry, ancient magic isn't classified as a branch of magic at all. It's classified as a precondition. Like, it's not a type of spell, it's what spells run on top of. It's the substrate. Her voice was doing the thing where she was restraining how excited she was by consciously measuring her words. And there are exactly 3 documented cases in the last 400 years of ancient magic manifesting in a structured, patterned way on a living person, and in all 3 cases the people involved were described as counterparts, Harry said. She stopped. Stared at him. You already know. Some of it. How much? Enough to know that what's on my arm is 1/2 of a recognition mark from the old compact. He watched her face go through 5 expressions in about 3 seconds, landing on something that was mostly controlled astonishment with a layer of vindication underneath. The other half is on Daphne Greengrass. The vindication won out. I thought I saw something in the corridor. Her reaction was, she stopped herself. Reorganized. Right. You need to tell me everything. You need to not tell anyone. Obviously. She looked slightly offended. Harry. When have I ever, Ron? A beat. Ron is occasionally enthusiastic about information sharing, yes. She straightened her books on the table. I'll be careful. So he told her, not everything, but the shape of it. The night at 9 when the brand appeared. The library meeting with Daphne. The text. What the brand was doing. The corridor incident. The thing with Belby 15 minutes ago. Hermione listened with the focused intensity of someone committing information to memory while simultaneously cross-referencing it against everything she already knew, and when he finished she sat for a moment in silence. The Veela compulsion, she said finally. And the compliance spell tonight. It's not distinguishing between the type of external influence. It's distinguishing between magic that comes from you and magic that's being imposed on you. Yes. That's a very elegant system. She sounded genuinely admiring. And it will work on anything, potions, spells, ambient environmental charms, as long as the intent is to influence you against your own will or nature. Apparently. And you're not worried about this? She looked at him carefully. No. Most people would find it alarming, she said. Having something that powerful attached to them that they didn't choose and can't turn off. Harry thought about this honestly. The brand was warm on his arm, steady as always, doing nothing particular at this moment. I didn't choose the scar on my forehead either, he said. Or the Dursleys. Or the cupboard. Or any of it. I've had my whole life arranged around me by forces I didn't choose. He looked at her directly. This one's on my side. I'm not going to spend energy being frightened of the first thing that actually decided to be on my side. Hermione looked at him for a long moment. She had the expression of someone who had walked into a conversation expecting to offer reassurance and had instead found the conversation didn't need it. Okay, she said quietly. All right. I need access to the restricted section, Harry said. Daphne has family texts going back centuries, which is helpful, but the school library probably has things her family doesn't. Can you work out a way? Hermione's expression shifted into something more comfortable, the familiar territory of a problem with a practical solution. McGonagall might sign a pass for advanced research. She's been watching you in Transfiguration like you're an interesting puzzle she wants to keep exploring. If you ask about ancient magic in a theoretical context, not the brand, just the general field, she might. You do it, Harry said. She likes you. You're systematic. Ask about research into pre-framework magical theory and see what she says. Hermione blinked. You want me to go to McGonagall for you? I want you to go to McGonagall for us. You, me, and the research project. He picked up his quill again. You're better at that conversation than I am. I tend to be, he thought about how to put it. Direct, Hermione supplied. In a way that sometimes makes teachers reconsider the premise, he agreed. She laughed, short, surprised, genuine. All right. I'll speak to her Monday morning. She opened one of her books and then looked up again. Harry. The thing with Belby tonight. He's going to tell someone what happened. Good, Harry said. She looked at him. Every time someone tries something and it doesn't work, he said, which was almost exactly what Daphne had told him in the library, that's information spreading through the castle without me having to do anything. Hermione stared at him. Then she looked toward the dungeon direction with a slightly different expression. She told you that, didn't she? Greengrass. Harry kept writing his essay. I can't tell if the ancient magic knew what it was doing, Hermione said, more to herself than to him, or if it was very, very lucky. Draco Malfoy found Harry the next morning. Not in a corridor, in the entrance hall, before breakfast, which meant it was deliberate. Draco was standing with Crabbe and Goyle in the standard formation, which Harry had noticed early on functioned as a social geometry meant to convey inevitability, the two large ones slightly back, the sharp-faced one in front, arranged to suggest that stopping was the only sensible option. Harry stopped. Not because the formation suggested he should, but because he was interested in what was coming. He had been at Hogwarts for 6 weeks now and had formed a clear picture of Draco Malfoy. He was intelligent, Harry had seen his work in class, the speed of his spell work, the quality of his potion instincts that he tried to hide behind bravado. He was performing something, performing the family legacy, performing the confident superiority, performing a Hogwarts role that had apparently been scripted for him before he arrived. And underneath the performance there was a boy who was genuinely frightened of the idea that the hierarchy he'd been told to inherit might be less stable than advertised. That fear made him more dangerous than straightforward arrogance would have, because frightened people with something to prove pushed harder. Potter, Draco said, with the casual ownership of someone who expected the name to do work. Malfoy, Harry said, with the same tone, which immediately changed the shape of the conversation. Draco absorbed this. Interesting thing in the corridor last week. Yes. People are talking about what happened to Fleur. He watched Harry with pale, sharp eyes. Saying something came off you. Something old. Something came off me, Harry confirmed. Draco waited for elaboration. Harry didn't provide any. This seemed to frustrate Draco in a way he was working to conceal. My father, he said, changing angles, knows quite a lot about unusual magical events. If you wanted to understand what, I already understand it, Harry said. Another recalibration. Draco was good at this, Harry gave him credit for adapting quickly. The Greengrass girl, he said, more carefully. You've been meeting with her. In the library. Yes. Daphne doesn't make friends outside her house. We're not friends, Harry said, which was technically true and felt slightly strange to say. We're researching something together. A Gryffindor and a Slytherin, Draco said, and his voice had an edge now, something personal underneath the political framing. Daphne's family and my family have an understanding. Have for years. He let that sit. The kind of understanding that makes certain associations questionable. Harry looked at him. Looked at the pale face and the careful voice and the way Draco was holding himself with the specific tension of someone delivering a message they'd been instructed to deliver and making it look like their own idea. Does Daphne know about this understanding? A flicker. It's between the families, does she know? Harry said. The flicker became something sharper. Draco straightened. What happens in the corridor is one thing. What you're doing with Daphne Greengrass is nothing you have standing to comment on, Harry said, pleasantly and absolutely. Not angry. Not challenging. Just closing a door. If you have something relevant to say about the corridor, say it. Otherwise, I'm going to breakfast. Crabbe and Goyle exchanged a look that suggested they were having trouble locating their cues. Draco looked at Harry for a long moment, really looked, in a way that felt less like social posturing and more like actual assessment, and Harry held it without difficulty. You don't know what you're carrying, Draco said, and his voice was different now. Quieter. Something almost genuine in it. You think it's simple. It isn't. I know exactly what I'm carrying, Harry said. I've known for 2 years. He walked past them to breakfast. The brand was warm and steady and thoroughly unbothered, and behind him he heard no footsteps following, no further words, just the particular silence of 3 boys standing in the entrance hall reassessing a conversation that hadn't gone the way they'd planned. Ron was already at the table with a mountain of toast. What did Malfoy want? To tell me something I already knew. Harry sat down, reached for the pumpkin juice. He mentioned the Greengrasses. Something about a family understanding. Ron's face did something. The Malfoy Greengrass thing? Yeah, my mum mentioned that once. Old arrangement. Nothing official, but there's a... He made a vague gesture that suggested the specifics were above his current interest level. Traditional expectation sort of thing. Does Daphne know? Ron looked at him. Does it matter? Those old family things, they don't actually. Does she know? Harry said again. Ron opened his mouth, closed it. I don't know, he said honestly. Probably. She seems like someone who knows things. Harry ate his eggs. Across the hall, at the Slytherin table, Daphne was sitting with Pansy Parkinson and 2 other girls, eating with precise, unhurried movements, apparently engaged in conversation. She didn't look toward the Gryffindor table. She rarely did, in public. But the brand was warm, and Harry had the distinct impression, no logical basis for it, just the bone-deep instinct of someone who was learning to read the thing, that she knew he was there the same way he always knew she was in a room. The old compact, the text had said, marks 2 people whose combined magical natures are capable of something larger than either could access independently. He looked at the eggs on his plate and at the morning light coming through the great hall windows and at the 11-year-old Slytherin girl eating breakfast across the room, and thought, we have a lot of work to do before we get to the larger thing. But that was all right. He had time. And for the first time in his life, he had something working in his corner. Later that morning, Hermione came back from talking to McGonagall with 2 things, a signed pass for the restricted section, and the information that McGonagall had looked at her with the expression of a person who knows more than they're saying and had told her, very carefully, that students who encounter unusual magical events should feel free to come to her directly if they have concerns. She knows something, Hermione said. Or suspects something, Harry said. Either way, she's left a door open. Hermione handed him the restricted section pass. I think she wants you to walk through it. Harry looked at the pass. Then he pocketed it, and pulled out the parchment note he'd made to himself about the brand and Marcus Belby's compliance spell, and added, McGonagall. Keep door open. Don't walk through it yet. What are you thinking? Hermione asked, reading his face. That every adult who finds out about this is going to have an opinion about what it means, Harry said, and I'd like to know what it means myself before I start hearing everyone else's version. He stood up, tucking the parchment away. Library? Always, Hermione said, and picked up her books. The brand pulsed once, steady, warm, and thoroughly patient, the way very old things are patient when they have already done the most important work. Chapter 3, The Shape of Ancient Things. Professor Vector taught arithmancy on the 4th floor in a classroom that smelled of chalk dust and something faintly metallic, like old coins. The walls were covered in numerical grids and symbol matrices that first years weren't supposed to understand yet, which made Harry want to understand them immediately. He wasn't taking arithmancy, that was a third-year elective, but he had found, 3 weeks into his research with Daphne and Hermione, that every trail he followed through the restricted section eventually cited the same source, a monograph on pre-framework magical structuring written by one Professor Septima Vector, published internally through the Hogwarts Academic Archive 17 years ago and never made widely available. He went to find her on a Wednesday afternoon when he had a free period and Vector's classroom was empty except for her. She was grading papers at her desk and looked up when he knocked on the open door. She was a compact woman, 50s, with reading glasses pushed up into iron-gray hair and the particular quality of attention that certain academics have, the kind that evaluates before engaging. "Mr. Potter," she said. "Not surprised. I wondered when you'd come." Harry came in. "You've been expecting me?" "I've been expecting someone to come asking about pre-framework magic since October." "You're earlier than I anticipated." She set down her quill. "Sit." He sat in the front row. She looked at him over her reading glasses with an expression that reminded him slightly of McGonagall, the same quality of assessment, but where McGonagall's was warm underneath, Vector's was more like a mathematician looking at a proof she found interesting. "You've been in the restricted section," she said. "I have a pass." "I know. Minerva told me." She folded her hands. "What have you found?" "References to your monograph in 6 separate texts," Harry said. "And a family text from the Greengrass archive that describes recognition marks in terms almost identical to your Section 4. Something moved through her expression, not surprise, more like confirmation of a hypothesis she'd held for a while. "The Greengrass girl has the other mark." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, looking at him. "How much do you already know, Mr. Potter?" "I prefer not to repeat information." Harry liked her immediately for this. He laid it out, the old compact, the recognition function, the protection against external influence, the events in the corridor and the common room, Daphne's family texts, what Hermione had cross-referenced from the citation chains in the library. Vector listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "Your arithmancy is better than I expected." "I haven't taken arithmancy." "You described the mechanics of what the mark does in terms of systems and functions," she said. "Input, resistance, dissolution. That's arithmetic thinking." She stood, moved to the board, and began writing in the quick shorthand of someone who thinks better with chalk in hand. "What the texts are calling ancient magic, what your mark is an expression of, is not a separate category of magic. It is the base numerical structure of magic itself. The substrate, yes, as Granger apparently identified. But more specifically, it is the governing logic." She wrote a grid on the board, numbers and symbols Harry couldn't read yet but whose structure he could feel the shape of. All magic that humans cast operates within the governing logic. Charms, transfiguration, potions, they work because the governing logic allows them, because they operate within rules that the structure permits. What humans call dark magic works the same way, it's still within the structure, just using functions the structure discourages. She tapped the center of the grid. "The old compact is different. It is of the governing logic. It doesn't work within the rules. It is a rule." Harry looked at the board. "So it can't be overridden. Nothing a human casts can override it. Not because it's powerful in the way a powerful spell is powerful, but because it exists at a different level of the system entirely." She turned back to face him. "Your mark doesn't resist influence because it's stronger than the influence. It resists because influence directed at you from outside the bond is, from the governing logic's perspective, a structural error. A violation of the rules the system runs on. The system corrects the error. And the backlash is the correction. The backlash is the energy released during correction, yes. The Veela aura incident was relatively minor, ambient, inherited, low intentionality. A deliberate targeted compulsion would release considerably more energy. She looked at him steadily. If someone were to cast something significant and sustained, a binding, a loyalty oath compulsion, a full cognitive influence charm, the correction would be violent enough to cause serious magical damage to the caster. Good, Harry said. Vector's mouth did a small, dry thing. Most people receiving this information express concern. Most people haven't had their whole life arranged around them by people who thought they knew best, Harry said. He met her eyes directly. What aren't you telling me? A pause. She took her glasses off, cleaned them on her robe with careful movements, put them back. I wrote the monograph when I was 32, she said. I had found references in the archive here, old enough that most people hadn't bothered to read them, and I followed them back. I spent 4 years on the research. She looked at the grid on the board. I presented my conclusions to the headmaster at the time. Dumbledore. Yes. Her voice was perfectly level. He read the monograph and told me it was excellent theoretical work and asked me not to publish it externally. A pause. He said the information could be destabilizing in the wrong hands. He was not wrong about that. But his definition of wrong hands was very broad. Harry looked at her. He didn't want people knowing the governing logic could produce something that couldn't be controlled. He didn't want people knowing it was already in operation, she said carefully. The monograph describes the conditions under which the old compact produces recognition marks. I had identified, from historical records, that the conditions were rare but not impossible, and that the last documented case before this century was, as you found, 1423. She sat back down behind her desk. I published internally. For the archive. Where it could be found by someone who knew to look. Harry absorbed this. You left a trail. I left accurate information in an accessible location, she said. In case it became relevant. She held his gaze. It has apparently become relevant. Harry thought about Dumbledore, about the kind blue eyes and the manner of comfortable authority, the way the headmaster spoke to people like he was letting them in on something while somehow never actually giving them the whole picture. He thought about the chess piece quality of the way his life had been arranged, the Dursleys, the secrecy, the way everyone in the wizarding world seemed to have a role prepared for him already. Does Dumbledore know? He said. About me and Daphne. He will have noticed the corridor incident, Vector said. He notices most things that happen in the school. A pause. Whether he has connected it to my monograph, I don't know. Whether, if he has, he'll address it directly or manage it from a distance, I also don't know. She was choosing every word with arithmetic precision. Harry heard what she wasn't saying. He'll want to understand what it means, Harry said. And then he'll want to ensure it serves the purpose he's already planning for. Vector looked at him for a long moment. You're 11 years old, Mr. Potter. Yes. You think very clearly for 11. I had a lot of time to think, Harry said. 31 inches wide is not a lot of space for much else. She frowned. He hadn't meant to say that, it had just come out, honest and flat. She filed it without making a production of it, which he appreciated. Come to me if you find something in the restricted texts you can't parse, she said. The notation system in anything pre-15th century requires context I can give you. She turned back to her papers. And Mr. Potter. Be careful not to dismiss the headmaster as simply manipulative. He is a man who genuinely believes what he does is correct. That makes him more complicated to navigate than a straightforward opponent. I know, Harry said. He stood, straightened his bag. Thank you, Professor. Don't thank me. I simply gave you accurate information. What you do with it is entirely up to you. She was already reading her papers again. That's rather the point of the whole thing. He walked back down the 4th floor corridor and thought about governing logic and structural rules and the specific way Vector had said that's rather the point of the whole thing, like someone who had been waiting 17 years for the proof of her theorem to walk into her classroom. The Slytherin common room politics had begun shifting in week 4 of term, and by November they had become a visible geological event. Daphne noticed it the way she noticed most things, not by paying attention to the event itself but by reading the behaviors of the people around the event. Pansy had become more circumspect in her social commentary. Theodore Nott had started taking slightly different routes between classes, routing himself past the library at hours when he would not normally have gone near the library. Blaise Zabini, who was the most consistently observant person in their year group, had asked Daphne twice in October about unusual magical theory in a way that was clearly not about magical theory. What they were all responding to, she understood, was the corridor incident and its aftermath. And what the corridor incident meant in the Slytherin social geometry was this: Daphne Greengrass, whose family was old and whose composure was a known quantity and whose social position was stable, had a visible and active connection to Harry Potter that had produced a documented magical event powerful enough to stagger 20 people and eliminate an inherited Veela compulsion. In the Slytherin hierarchy, this was not a small data point. The conversation she had been dreading came on the third Sunday in November, when she was in the Slytherin common room reading after dinner and Draco sat down across from her with the careful casualness of someone who had prepared for a conversation and was trying to make it look spontaneous. "Daphne," he said. "Draco." She turned a page. Not rudely, she just continued reading until she reached a natural stopping point, which was its own kind of message. Then she closed the book and looked at him. Draco was performing comfort. Sitting slightly sideways, elbow on the armrest, projecting ease. She knew every performing comfort tell he had, having watched him deploy them since they were 6 at their parents' shared social events. The slight forward lean meant he thought this was going to be adversarial. The deliberate eye contact meant he decided to lead with directness rather than deflection. "The Potter thing," he said. "The research," she said. "Yes. My father had a conversation with your father." Daphne kept her expression easy. "Did he?" "The arrangement between the families, Draco." Her voice was pleasant and absolutely final. "What arrangement are you referring to?" A fraction of discomfort. He pushed past it. "The traditional understanding, our families have discussed. Has your father made a formal approach to my father regarding a betrothal contract?" The word betrothal sat between them with all the weight of what it meant in their world, not a romantic word, a legal one, a social architecture word. Draco's jaw tightened slightly. "Not a formal contract." Then there is no arrangement," Daphne said, with perfect composure and a quality underneath it that was not cold but was very firm. "There is your father's ambition and the conversations he has with people about the future before that future has agreed to participate." She tilted her head. "I'm sure you understand the distinction." Draco was quiet for a moment. She had not raised her voice. She had not been unkind. She had simply refused the premise and named exactly what was happening. His reaction to that, the way he looked at her, was more complex than she'd expected. There was frustration, yes, and something political about the set of his jaw. But there was also something that looked almost like respect, reluctant and brief, before it disappeared back behind the Malfoy performance. "The mark on your arm," he said, quietly now. "People in my family know about soul brands, Daphne. My father knows what you're carrying." "He's not going to. What I'm carrying is mine," she said, in the same pleasant, final voice. "Not my father's, not yours, not your father's. Mine." She picked her book back up. "If Lucius Malfoy wants to have a conversation about that, he can have it with me directly." Draco stared at her. "He would never, then we have no problem." She opened her book. "Good night, Draco." He left. She read the same sentence 4 times without taking it in. Her heart was doing something irritating and fast, the way it did when she ran tactical conversations through in the aftermath and checked for errors. She hadn't made any errors. She had said exactly what she meant to say. The mark on her arm was warm. She pressed her hand over it through her robe and looked at the fire across the room and thought, in the clear-minded way she thought about most things, Lucius Malfoy knowing about soul brands was not good. That was a man who treated information the way other people treated weapons. You gathered it, you stored it, and you used it at the moment of maximum effect. She needed to tell Harry. She needed to tell him tonight, except it was Sunday and the castle after curfew was monitored and the direct route to Gryffindor Tower was past two of the most active patrol routes she had mapped in her first 2 weeks. She worked through the problem while pretending to read and had a route assembled in 4 minutes, the servant passages behind the tapestry on the 2nd floor, then the back stairs that came out behind the portrait of the fat lady on 7, which she had identified 3 weeks ago when she'd been testing alternatives for exactly this kind of situation. She waited until the common room had thinned to the night owls and the insomniacs, and then she went. The portrait of the fat lady said the password was Caput Draconis, and then said it again in a tone of increasing offense when Daphne declined to provide it, and then said it a third time when Daphne said quietly, "Tell Harry Potter someone needs to speak with him. It's important." The fat lady looked at her with the expression of a portrait who has seen 11 decades of students doing questionable things at late hours and has developed comprehensive opinions about all of it. "You're not in Gryffindor," the portrait said. "Correct." "You're in Slytherin." "Also correct." "This is most irregular." "Please tell him," Daphne said. The portrait grumbled. Daphne stood in the corridor with her wand in her hand, listening for prefect footsteps, and after approximately 3 minutes the portrait swung open and Harry was there in his school robes that he had clearly just thrown on, his hair doing what his hair always did, which was everything at once. He took in the sight of her standing in the corridor at nearly 11 at night and his face went from startled to alert without going through alarm in between. "Malfoy's father," Daphne said. "He knows about soul brands. He's been in communication with my father. I need you to know tonight because by tomorrow morning there may be movement and I want us to be in the same position when it starts." Harry processed this. Stepped out into the corridor, closing the portrait behind him. How much does he know? "Enough to understand that the brand makes me and you a meaningful political unit," she said. "Enough to find that threatening. Enough to have been communicating with my father before either of us was even at school, which means he's been watching this since my brand appeared." Harry was quiet for a moment, and she watched his face doing what it did when he was thinking fast, very still, eyes focused on something internal. "He wouldn't come to us directly," he said. "He'd work through Draco or your father. Keep himself at a remove." "Yes. And if he decides the bond is something he wants to neutralize, he'll look for an institutional pathway. Something through the ministry or through Dumbledore, wrapped in enough legitimate framing that it looks like concern rather than interference." "Can he actually do anything?" Harry said. "The brand burns out interference. Directly. The brand burns out magical interference," Daphne said. "Legal and institutional pressure is a different mechanism. If the ministry decides a soul bond is a registrable event under some obscure statute," she stopped. "My father is not Lucius Malfoy's puppet. But he's susceptible to certain arguments about propriety and tradition, and Malfoy is very good at those arguments." Harry leaned against the wall, arms crossed, looking at the floor in front of him. Daphne waited. She had learned already, in the weeks of library meetings and research conversations, that Harry's silences were worth waiting through. He wasn't stalling, he was building something, and when he looked up it was usually with the whole picture. "Vector," he said. Daphne looked at him. "The arithmancy professor. She wrote the monograph that documents what we are. She's kept it in the archive on purpose, a trail for us to find. She told me Dumbledore knows about the monograph and asked her not to publish it externally." He met her eyes. "Dumbledore has had 17 years to think about what a recognition mark pair would mean. Lucius Malfoy has had 2 years. Dumbledore is further ahead." Daphne absorbed this. The fire of it landed somewhere clean and cool. She had been thinking about the Malfoy angle and had not been thinking clearly enough about the Dumbledore angle, and the fact that Harry had pulled the two threads together in a silent 30 seconds was something she filed in the section of her mind that she was building specifically for him. So we have two forces who want to define what we are before we define it ourselves. We have the brand, 17 years of Vector's research, your family's restricted texts, and everything Hermione's found in the citation chains, Harry said. And we have the restricted section pass. And we have the fact that every time someone tries to interfere directly, the bond burns it out and they lose ground. Yes. He looked at her. We need to get ahead of the institutional angle before Malfoy can build one. Which means we need to understand the full legal landscape of recognition marks under current wizarding law. If there's a statute that lets the ministry register or regulate bonds, I can get that, Daphne said. My father's legal library. I can write home this week under the guise of wanting research materials for a school project. He won't ask too many questions, he thinks my academic intensity is healthy. A small, dry beat. He's not entirely wrong. And I'll go back to Vector, Harry said. There's more she knows that she hasn't said yet. She was choosing her words very carefully and some of the gaps were deliberate. Daphne nodded. She should go back, this was what she came to tell him, this had been said, the practical path was to return to the dungeons now and cover her tracks. But she stood for another moment in the corridor with the late-night castle quiet around them and the brand warm on her arm and Harry looking at her with those steady green eyes that she had been thinking about, with academic objectivity and almost no personal investment whatsoever. Quite a lot. Draco said you were carrying something you didn't understand, she said. He said the same thing to me. He was wrong. He wasn't entirely wrong, she said, which was the most honest thing she had said in this conversation and she said it carefully. We don't fully understand what it's building toward. We know what it does. We don't know the scale of it. Harry was quiet for a moment. Then, does that frighten you? She considered lying. She considered deflecting. She looked at him in the dim corridor with the portrait of the fat lady murmuring to herself 15 feet away and said, no. What frightens me is the possibility of understanding it fully and finding out we're not equal to it. Harry looked at her for a long moment. We're not equal to it yet, he said. Yet is the operative word. It was an entirely ordinary thing to say and it landed in her chest like a stone in still water. She turned before whatever was in her expression could become readable. Good night, Harry. Go carefully, he said. The second-floor tapestry passage opened stiffly. You have to lean into it. She paused without turning around. How do you know about the second-floor tapestry passage? I've been mapping the castle since week 1, he said, with the complete simplicity of someone who doesn't see this as unusual. Old habit. She walked away in the dark and thought that 2 years ago she had felt something find her through the night, and had spent those 2 years preparing to understand it, and what she had not prepared for was the specific texture of being seen by someone who also spent their time carefully mapping the exact shape of the world around them. She got back to the dungeons without incident. She lay in her bed in the dark with the warmth on her arm and thought about what she'd said. What frightens me is finding out we're not equal to it. She revised this, in the privacy of her own head, with the precision she applied to everything. What frightened her was finding out she wasn't equal to wanting what she was increasingly, inconveniently, thoroughly aware that she wanted. The second deliberate compulsion attempt happened on the 1st of December. Harry was in the restricted section with Hermione, both of them working from opposite ends of a stack of reference texts on pre-framework magical governance, when it hit. This one was not ambient and not subtle. This was targeted, professional, and very specifically designed, a cognitive orientation charm of the kind used in ministry interrogations, the sort that didn't force you to think or feel anything directly, but quietly adjusted the lens through which you processed information. Made certain conclusions feel natural. Made certain people seem trustworthy. Made certain paths of action seem obvious. It had about half a second to establish before the brand obliterated it. The backlash was not quiet. Every book within 4 feet of Harry flew off its shelf simultaneously. The candles in the restricted section went out and relit themselves in the space of a heartbeat. Hermione, who was 6 feet away and therefore outside the radius of the backlash, gripped the edge of the shelf with white knuckles and stared. "That was targeted," she said, when the books had finished falling. "Yes." Harry stood up. He could feel the direction, not precisely, but approximately. The magic had come from somewhere above them. Upper floors. "Someone knew where I was." "Someone is monitoring your movements," Hermione said, and her voice had the quality of someone doing a calculation and not liking the result. She looked at the scattered books. "Harry. That was a professional-grade charm. Not student work. That was something someone with real training cast." Harry thought about what Daphne had said in the corridor. Lucius Malfoy knowing about soul brands is not good. He thought about Draco, who had said, "My father knows what you're carrying." He thought about the chain of people with institutional access to the castle who were not students. "I need to talk to Daphne," he said. "You need to tell McGonagall." "Not yet." He started collecting the fallen books, methodical and quick. "Hermione. If we go to McGonagall, she goes to Dumbledore. And I'm not ready for Dumbledore to have this conversation." He looked at her. "Can you identify the charm signature? Document what it was and where it came from?" Hermione stared at him, at the books, at the space where the magic had been. Her jaw set in a way he'd come to recognize, the expression of someone choosing between their instinct to involve adults and their trust in a person in front of them. The trust won, which was something he didn't take for granted. "I can try. The residual will fade in a few hours, but I can document the structure now." She pulled parchment and a quill from her bag with the speed of someone who always came prepared. "But Harry, professional-grade compulsion directed at a first-year student on school grounds is serious. If this continues, it won't," Harry said. He was very sure about this. In the bone-deep way he was sure about things the brand was involved in. Because whoever cast that is going to try to understand why it failed, and then they're going to try something else, and each time they try something else they're going to get the same result and lose ground. He picked up the last book. "Let them keep trying." Hermione wrote quickly, capturing the residual signature with notations that were already, he noticed, more sophisticated than most third-year work. She looked up when she was done. "This is going to escalate." "Yes. And you're not worried?" Harry thought about a 31-inch cupboard. He thought about measuring the exact shape of his containment with a stolen ruler and finding it clarifying. He thought about 2 years of warm, steady weight on his arm telling him the same true thing every day. "What I am," he said, "is ready." Daphne found him after dinner in the library, the regular section this time, the window table, and sat down across from him without preamble, and before he could say anything about the restricted section incident she said, "The book my father sent arrived this morning. There is a ministry statute. 1722, the Bonding Regulation Act. It allows the ministry to register, study, and in some cases regulate what it calls spontaneous magical bonding events if those events are deemed to have significant social or political implications." "Define significant," Harry said. "The text is deliberately vague." She put a sheaf of parchment on the table, clearly her own notes, dense and precise. "But there's a case from 1891 where the ministry used the statute to assign a ministry liaison to a bonded pair for the duration of their time at Hogwarts. The liaison had authority to observe, to access information about the bond's development, and, this is the relevant part, to intervene if the bond was developing in ways considered contrary to social stability." Harry looked at the notes. "So the statute gives them a legal framework to put a watchdog on us." "More than that. The 1891 liaison eventually argued that one of the bonded pair was a risk to the other's well-being, and used that argument to recommend enforced separation." She held his gaze. "The bond burned through the separation within a week, which the ministry recorded as a safety incident and used to push for broader bonding regulation, which is where the 1897 amendment came from, which expanded. They'll do the same thing, Harry said. If Malfoy gets to the ministry before we understand the statute fully enough to challenge it, yes. She sat back. The statute has never been formally challenged in court. It's been used 6 times in its history, always against bonded pairs who didn't have the information or the resources to dispute it. Harry looked at the parchment. Looked at Daphne's small, precise handwriting and the careful organization of the notes, the way she had laid out the statute and the case precedents and the amendment history in a clear logical sequence. 2 months ago she had been a stranger whose arm matched his. Now she was sitting across from him having read ministry legal archives because someone needed to and she had done it without being asked, and he felt something very clear and simple, which was that the old compact had been paying excellent attention. "We need Vector," he said. "The monograph, if it's in the archive, it has formal academic standing. And if the mark is documented as an expression of the governing logic, the precondition layer, then the Bonding Regulation Act doesn't apply. You can't regulate a structural rule. It's like passing a law against gravity." Daphne looked at him. Something shifted in her face, the rapid, visible motion of a mind engaging with an idea that works. "The statute only applies to bonding events," she said slowly. "If the mark is legally established as something that exists at the pre-framework level, before bonding, before magic as humans legally define it, then the statute has no jurisdiction," Harry said. "It has nothing to regulate." "We'd need Vector's monograph entered into the official record," Daphne said. "Not just the archive. Formally submitted to the Ministry's Division of Magical Governance as an academic finding on the classification of the governing logic." "Can Vector do that?" "She wrote it. She can submit it." Daphne paused. She'd be going around Dumbledore's request. "She left a trail on purpose," Harry said. "She's been waiting for this." They looked at each other across the table in the library that had become, over the past 2 months, something like their headquarters, not because it was romantic or dramatic but because it was useful and quiet and full of the information they needed, and they were the kind of people who went where the information was. "I'll speak to her tomorrow," Harry said. "We'll speak to her tomorrow," Daphne said. He almost pointed out that 2 Slytherin-Gryffindor meetings with a professor outside of class would raise eyebrows. He looked at her face and decided not to bother, because her expression made clear she had already calculated the eyebrow risk and decided it was worth it. Together, he agreed. The brand was steady and warm, and when he looked at the mark in the candlelight of the library, at the compass and flame design that had been on his arm since the night he was 9 years old alone in a 31-inch cupboard, it looked less like a mark and more like the beginning of a map, the kind of map that doesn't show you where you are, but shows you where you're going. Outside the library windows, the December dark had come down over the castle and the grounds, and somewhere out there, in the direction of the upper floors, whoever had tried to cast a professional-grade compulsion into the restricted section and gotten 17 books thrown at them by the backlash was sitting with that information and deciding what to do next. Harry picked up his quill. Daphne opened her notes. Hermione, who had arrived from somewhere during the last 5 minutes and had apparently assessed the atmosphere and decided to sit 3 chairs down and work independently until required, was already writing. The mark burned steady on both their arms, warm as a coal, patient as stone, entirely unworried about whatever came next. Chapter 4, What the Ministry Wants. The owl arrived on a Tuesday. Harry knew it was official before he opened it because of the seal, deep purple wax stamped with the ministry crest, the kind of seal that said this is not a letter, this is a document, and the kind of document that was designed to feel heavy in your hands. He was at breakfast when it landed in front of him, and the hall had enough activity that only the people immediately around him noticed. Ron looked at the seal. Hermione looked at Harry. Harry opened it with the same deliberate calm he had used on everything since October. The letter was from a Department of Magical Governance official named Reginald Thorne, Senior Liaison for Spontaneous Magical Events, And it informed Harry Potter that the Ministry had become aware of a possible spontaneous magical bonding event occurring at Hogwarts School and that the department was exercising its authority under the Bonding Regulation Act of 1722 to conduct a preliminary assessment. That said assessment would involve a representative visiting Hogwarts at the end of the week. And that the subject or subjects of the assessment were encouraged to cooperate fully, as non-cooperation could result in formal escalation to the Wizengamot. Harry read it twice. Set it down. Picked up his fork and ate his eggs. Harry, Hermione said, in the voice she used when she wanted him to react and he wasn't reacting in a way she could work with. I know, he said. Eat your breakfast. That's a Ministry summons. It's a visit request. There's a difference. He glanced toward the Slytherin table without making it obvious. Daphne was reading a letter of her own. Her face was entirely composed except for a very slight tension in the line of her shoulders that he had learned to read as controlled irritation. She had clearly gotten an identical letter, then. Their eyes met across the hall for just a second. She folded her letter with precise movements and tucked it inside her robe. He finished his eggs. He went to Vector's classroom before first period. She was at her desk as usual, but she looked up when he knocked with an expression that told him she already knew. She had a copy of the same letter, he realized, an official notification to the school, see seat to the headmaster and senior staff. They moved faster than I expected, she said. Malfoy, Harry said. Almost certainly. He has 3 Ministry contacts in magical governance and he knows how to write a referral that sounds like civic concern. She folded her hands. The liaison they're sending, Reginald Thorne, is competent and thorough and politically careful. He is not Malfoy's puppet. He'll conduct a genuine assessment. Which means we can work with him if we have the right information in place before he arrives, Harry said. Vector looked at him. You're going to ask me to submit the monograph. Today if possible. She was quiet. He let her be quiet, because this was a real moment, 17 years of a thing she had written and been told to keep quiet, and he was asking her to take it into the open, and that was worth a genuine moment of consideration. Dumbledore will be, she started. Unhappy, Harry said. Yes. But the monograph is accurate. It's documented. It's been in the archive for 17 years with proper academic dating. If you submit it to the Division of Magical Governance as an established academic finding on the pre-framework classification of the governing logic, before Thorne arrives, it changes the legal landscape of his entire assessment. He could still conduct the assessment. Under what statutory authority? Harry said. If the bond is established in the official record as an expression of the governing logic, not a bonding event, not a spontaneous magical occurrence, but a structural rule of magic itself, the Bonding Regulation Act of 1722 has no jurisdiction. It's like Thorne arriving to regulate the tide. Vector was very still. That's the argument. That's the argument Daphne worked out from the statute, Harry said. It's solid. But it only works if your research is in the official record before the assessment begins. If Thorne arrives first and conducts the preliminary assessment under the Act, the classification is established as a bonding event and we spend the next year arguing precedent. She stood. Went to the window. Outside, the December grounds were silver-white with frost, and the black lake sat iron-gray under a low sky. She looked out at it for a moment. Albus will know it was me, she said. Yes. He'll want an explanation. Tell him the truth. That when you realize the situation had become live, keeping the research out of the official record would have been actively harmful to the people it documented. Harry kept his voice even. He can't argue against that without admitting he'd rather have us unprotected. Vector turned from the window. She looked at him with the expression of someone who has just watched a proof resolve. You understand, she said, that doing this will make you more visible, not less. The Ministry official record is public access. The moment I submit, Anyone paying attention to the Division of Magical Governance's incoming filings will know that the governing logic has produced a recognition mark pair for the first time in 600 years, Harry said. Yes. I know. And you're not concerned about that visibility. I'm 11 years old and I destroyed a hereditary Veela compulsion in front of 20 witnesses in a school corridor, Harry said. The visibility ship has sailed. She almost smiled. Almost. I'll submit it this morning, she said. Express filing through the academic record, it'll be in the ministry's system by noon. Thank you, Professor. Don't. She was already moving toward her desk, pulling parchment. I'm correcting a 17-year-old mistake. You're just the reason I finally have standing to correct it. Daphne had her own morning planned. She had written to her father the previous night, not a letter she had labored over, but a precise, direct document that laid out the situation and her understanding of it and the action she was requesting from him. It was, she knew, not the letter of a normal 11-year-old to her parent. It was the letter of someone who had assessed a situation and was communicating findings to a relevant stakeholder. Her father's response arrived by mid-morning owl. Daphne. The monograph approach is elegant. Vector's filing this morning will complicate Thorn's mandate. I have spoken with the family solicitor, Mortimer Gale, whom you've met, and he is available Friday should the ministry visit require legal representation. I have not spoken to Lucius. I am making that choice deliberately and want you to know I am making it deliberately. Your mother sends love. Astoria has asked if she can have your old Quidditch book. Tell Harry Potter that he should know my daughter chooses her own associations. Daphne read this 3 times. The last line was her father's way of saying something significant without saying it directly, and what he was saying was, I'm not Malfoy's instrument, and I want the boy to know that. She folded the letter. She found, to her slight annoyance, that her chest was doing something warm and inconvenient. She found Pansy in the corridor between second and third period, because Pansy was the social architecture of their year group and needed to be in the correct position before Friday. The ministry visit, Daphne said, without preamble. Pansy's dark eyes sharpened. She had known something was coming since October. Pansy's primary talent was reading the social weather, and the social weather had been unusual since the corridor incident. Bonding regulation? Yes. I need you to know that my family has legal representation arranged and that Vectors filed her academic monograph with magical governance this morning, which means the ministry's statutory authority for the visit is already in question before Thorn arrives. She held Pansy's gaze. I'm not telling you this for your advice. I'm telling you so that when people in our house start speculating, you have the accurate version. Pansy absorbed this. There was a beat of silence in which she was clearly calculating social implications at high speed. Draco's going to push back. He found out about the letter this morning and Draco can do what he likes, Daphne said. That's not my concern right now. He'll take it to his father. His father already knows. His father is the reason the ministry is coming. She kept her voice even. Tell me something I can use, Pansy. Another beat. Thorn is apparently old friends with Slughorn. Whatever Slughorn knows about the situation, Thorn will know by Thursday evening. Daphne considered this. Slughorn collected talented students the way certain people collected art, with genuine appreciation and total self-interest. He had already attempted to recruit both her and Harry into his gatherings, and had been deflected with exactly as much grace as the situation required. Whether he actually knew anything about the bond beyond what he'd seen in the corridor was uncertain. Thank you, she said. Daphne. Pansy's voice had dropped to something more genuine. How much of this is it actually what people are saying it is? Daphne looked at her. Pansy was watching her with something that was, underneath the social calculation, actual concern, the specific concern of a friend who is watching someone navigate something large and doesn't know how to help. Yes, Daphne said. It is. And Potter. Yes. A long pause. Pansy had the expression of someone updating a very long-standing mental map. "Right," she said finally. "Right, okay. Then Slughorn's the priority. I'll find out what he knows by tomorrow." Reginald Thorne arrived on Friday morning. Harry knew he had arrived because Dumbledore pulled Harry out of Transfiguration before 10 o'clock with a note delivered by a second year, which McGonagall received with an expression that said she had opinions about the interruption she was choosing not to voice. Harry gathered his bag and followed the second year up to the headmaster's office and tried to use the 3 minutes of staircase climbing to organize everything he knew about what was about to happen. Thorne was already there when Harry arrived. He was a tall man, mid-50s, in ministry robes of a quality that said, "I'm important enough that my robes cost money, but I'm not flashy about it." He had a neat grey beard and reading glasses very similar to Vector's, and when Harry came in he stood and extended a hand with the manner of someone who treats formal situations formally and doesn't apologize for it. "Mr. Potter," he said. "Reginald Thorne, Department of Magical Governance. Thank you for coming." Harry shook his hand. "Mr. Thorne." Dumbledore was at his desk with his hands folded and his expression calibrated to benign concern. The portraits on the walls were all doing their best impression of sleeping while definitely listening. Harry sat in the chair that had been placed for him across from both of them and noticed the seating geometry, Thorne to the side, Dumbledore at the desk, Harry facing both. Arranged so that he was responding to two people simultaneously, which was the kind of thing that made people feel like they were being interviewed rather than questioned. Harry straightened his back and decided to feel neither. "I'll be straightforward, Mr. Potter," Thorne said, sitting back down and opening a leather folder. "The Ministry has received a referral citing a spontaneous magical bonding event at Hogwarts. I'm here to conduct a preliminary assessment under the Bonding Regulation Act of 1722. This isn't adversarial, it's standard procedure whenever we receive a credible report." "I understand," Harry said. "I'm also aware that Professor Vector filed her academic monograph with the Division of Magical Governance this morning." Thorne paused. Looked at his folder. Closed it. The pause was the controlled kind, the kind that says I have this information and I'm deciding how to engage with it, not this is a surprise. "I received that filing just before I arrived at the school," he said. "Naturally it's relevant to the assessment. Vector's monograph establishes that what's on my arm and on Daphne Greengrass's arm is an expression of the governing logic," Harry said. "The pre-framework substrate. Which is not a bonding event under any reasonable definition of the 1722 Act, because the Act's jurisdiction is limited to spontaneous magical bonds formed between persons, human cast events, essentially, or events that occur within the framework of operative magic. What the monograph describes as the old compact operates at the level the Act is built on top of." Thorne looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Dumbledore. Dumbledore's expression was very still in a way that Harry was learning to read as the face of a man choosing not to express what he was actually thinking. "You've read Vector's monograph," Thorne said. "I've been researching this for 2 years, Harry said. "I was 9 when it appeared." 2 years. Another pause. "You're 11. "Yes." Thorne leaned forward slightly. "The referral I received described the October corridor incident as a potentially dangerous uncontrolled magical event. The brand identified and dissolved an ambient Veela compulsion that was operating on me without my knowledge or consent," Harry said. "The residual energy release was the correction signature, not the event itself. Hermione Granger documented the magical signature within the hour if the Ministry wants the primary record." Thorne was quiet. He was looking at Harry with an expression that was shifting from formal assessment toward something more personal, not warmer exactly, but more present. Like he had come in with a file and was realizing the file was incomplete. "Mr. Potter," he said. "I want to be clear with you. I received this referral from a third party. I don't know the referral's motivations, and I don't, at this point, have grounds to assume they were benign." He glanced at the folder. Vector's filing changes the statutory landscape significantly. I'll need to review her findings in full before I can determine whether this falls under the Act. He paused. It may not. I know, Harry said. From the desk, Dumbledore said, pleasantly and unhurriedly, Harry, I wonder if you might give Mr. Thorne and I a few moments. No, Harry said. The room went very quiet. One of the portraits made a small sound. Dumbledore looked at Harry with those blue eyes that were kind and deep and accustomed to having things go the way he intended. No, he said. Any conversation between you and the Ministry about the mark on my arm is a conversation I should be present for, Harry said. The mark is mine. The policy discussion about it is mine to participate in. He held Dumbledore's gaze without difficulty, with the steady quality of someone who has been practicing being unintimidated since he was old enough to understand that being intimidated was a choice. If there are things you'd like to discuss with Mr. Thorne about the school's management of the situation, I'm happy to wait outside during that part. But the part that's about what I'm carrying and what it means, I'm in that room. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. Something moved behind the blue eyes, not anger, not frustration exactly. Something more like re-evaluation. The look of a man looking at a piece on a board that has moved in an unexpected direction. Of course, Dumbledore said, finally, warmly. Of course, Harry. Daphne's meeting with Thorne was in the afternoon, in a smaller office off the deputy headmistress's corridor, with Professor McGonagall present as her faculty advocate and the family solicitor Mortimer Gale connected by enchanted mirror from London, a small upright rectangle on the table that reflected Gale's sharp, elderly face. Thorne had apparently reviewed Vector's filing in the 3 hours between Harry's meeting and hers because his opening was different, less formal procedure, more genuine inquiry. Miss Greengrass, he said. I've read Professor Vector's monograph in full. I'd like to understand, from your perspective, what your experience of the mark has been. 2 years of the governing logic, she said. Functioning exactly as Vector's research describes. The compulsion incidents, Thorne looked at the folder. Professional grade. His voice was very even. You're certain of that characterization? Granger documented it. Vector has reviewed the documentation and confirmed the assessment. Gale's face in the mirror made a small, satisfied sound. The spell signature is consistent with Ministry interrogation class charms, which are not student castable and are not available for civilian purchase. She held Thorne's gaze. Someone with access to restricted Ministry spellwork cast a controlled cognitive influence on an 11-year-old child on school grounds. I'd suggest that's where your department's energy should be directed. McGonagall, to her left, was very still and very quiet, and her expression was the expression of a woman who had just received information she found extremely significant and was processing it with great internal intensity. Thorne closed his folder. He looked at Daphne, then at Gale in the mirror, then back at Daphne. Miss Greengrass. I want to say something that is not official Ministry position but is my genuine assessment. He leaned forward slightly. Vector's monograph is going to complicate this referral significantly. Whether the 1722 Act applies to what you and Mr. Potter are carrying is now a genuine legal question, and it's not one I can resolve in a single-day assessment. He paused. What I can tell you is that whoever made this referral did so with the explicit intent of using the Act's provisions to establish a Ministry liaison and oversight mandate. And whoever made this referral provided information about the professional compulsion incident that they had no way of knowing unless they were either directly involved in it or had access to detailed reporting from someone who was. The room absorbed this. You're telling us the referral source and the compulsion source may be connected, Daphne said. I'm not officially telling you anything, Thorne said carefully. I'm a Ministry official having a conversation with a first-year student. Then unofficially, she said, with the pleasant, absolute quality she had deployed on Draco in the common room. A beat. Unofficially, Thorne said, would recommend being careful. Gale cleared his throat from the mirror. The firm will be filing a formal objection to the jurisdiction of the 1722 Act by Monday morning, citing Vector's monograph as the academic basis, he said. Mr. Thorne, I trust the department will be in touch. Naturally, Thorne said. Harry found Daphne after dinner in the library, their table, the window, and they compared assessments with the efficiency of two people who had been doing this long enough to have developed a shared shorthand. Thorne's not Malfoy's instrument, Harry said. Agreed. He gave me information he didn't have to give me, framed as unofficial. She had her notes on the table. The referral source and the compulsion source may be connected, which narrows it considerably. Harry turned his quill in his fingers. Someone with access to ministry-level restricted spell work. Someone connected enough to Malfoy to move on his behalf. Someone who had detailed enough reporting on what happened in the restricted section to include it in a ministry referral. There are 3 people at Hogwarts with ministry clearance above standard staff level, Daphne said. She had clearly been thinking about this for hours. Dumbledore, obviously. Quirrell, who has a consulting arrangement with the Data Curriculum Committee that the ministry funds. She paused. And one other. A visiting academic who's been in the castle twice this term. I've seen him in the corridors but hadn't placed him until this afternoon. Name? His name is Rodolphus Lestrange Jr., she said. Her voice was careful and clean. He's 23. He's technically a postgraduate research student with a supervisory arrangement through Hogwarts. He arrived in October. Harry was quiet. He's Bellatrix Lestrange's nephew by marriage, Daphne said. His father is in Azkaban. He has full ministry clearance because he's cooperating with a post-war rehabilitation program that gives certain families clean slate access in exchange for documented cooperation. She looked at Harry. He was in the castle the day of the restricted section incident. The brand was warm and entirely steady, the way it was always steady, unbothered by the information even as Harry felt the weight of it landing. Someone had tried to compel him using ministry-grade spell work. That someone had probable access to Malfoy. That someone had been in the castle on purpose. Thorne told us to be careful, Harry said. Thorne gave us a name without giving us a name, Daphne said. He wants us to find it, because if he finds it through official channels and it traces back to a ministry-funded rehabilitation program that magical governance oversees, it becomes a political problem that Thorne personally owns. She met his eyes. If we find it independently and bring it to him as information from outside the ministry, he can act on it without the political complication. Harry looked at her. That's a very sophisticated read of a ministry official's motivations. My father is a political person, she said, without inflection. I grew up watching those conversations. We need proof, Harry said. Not supposition. Thorne can't act on speculation, and if we go to him without proof we show our hand to whoever's watching. Hermione, Daphne said. Yes. She documented the compulsion signature. If she can compare it against the signature profile of ministry interrogation charms, there are academic publications that describe the general structure without providing the specific casting methodology, and if Lestrange was in the castle that day, there may be a way to correlate. I'll talk to her tonight, Harry said. He paused. And I'll talk to Dumbledore. Daphne looked at him. You're going to tell him about Lestrange? I'm going to tell him that someone in his school used professional-grade compulsion on me and I've identified a probable source, Harry said. I'm not going to tell him how I identified it or what my evidence is. I'm going to tell him the name and watch his face. That's a significant risk. Less risk than leaving him without the information, Harry said. If Dumbledore knows about Lestrange and has been choosing not to act, his reaction to me raising it will tell me that. If he genuinely doesn't know, his reaction tells me that too. He looked at her steadily. Either way I learned something. Daphne looked at him for a moment. He had the familiar impression of her running calculations at high speed, checking his logic against her own model of the situation. If he already knows and is choosing not to act, she said slowly, he may act on Lestrange now to demonstrate goodwill. Which gives us a resolution but also demonstrates that he's been holding information back. Yes. And if he doesn't know, he has a genuine security failure in his school that he'll want to address quickly, which makes him, briefly, more transparent about what he does and doesn't have access to. Yes, Harry said. Either way, the information is accurate and the action is legitimate, and I'm not taking any risk I haven't already accepted. She looked at him. You're going to go tonight. Now, actually. He stood, picking up his bag. Don't go back to the dungeons alone tonight. Take Pansy or someone with you. She looked, for just a fraction of a second, like she was going to say I don't need, and then stopped herself, and what replaced it was something more genuine. All right, she said. He was halfway to the door when she said, quietly, Harry. He turned. She looked at him across the library in the candlelight with her note spread before her and her composure fully in place, and then she said, be careful, and her voice was slightly lower than her normal precise register. He held her gaze. I always am, he said. She tilted her head very slightly, less than half an inch, in the gesture he had learned meant no you aren't, but I believe you anyway. He almost smiled. Then he went. Dumbledore's reaction to the name Rodolphus Lestrange Jr. was very still. Not blank, Harry was watching too carefully for blank to cover it. Still. The kind of stillness that happens when you are deciding, in real time, how much surprise to show. Where did you come by this name, Harry? Dumbledore said, with great gentle care. The restricted section incident on December 1st, Harry said. The compulsion was ministry grade. I've had the signature analyzed. He was in the castle that day. The correlation is available if you want to see it. He held the headmaster's gaze. Did you know he was here? His visiting arrangement was approved through the standard process. Did you know about the arrangement when you approved it? Harry said. Not impolitely. Just directly. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. The blue eyes were doing their deep, kind, considering thing, and Harry sat with it and let it be what it was, which was a very intelligent man deciding what to do with a conversation that had not gone as planned. I approve the arrangement, Dumbledore said carefully. I was not aware he had used it to access parts of the castle beyond his designated research areas. Restricting that access would be useful, Harry said. Before anything else happens. Yes, Dumbledore said. It would. He looked at Harry with an expression that had something new in it, not quite respect, because Dumbledore was too accustomed to his own authority for it to be that simple. Something more like the look of a man who has been playing chess and realized his opponent has more pieces than he thought. You've been thorough. Someone tried to alter my thinking, Harry said. Yes. I've been thorough. Dumbledore nodded, slowly. I'll address the Lestrange situation tonight. He paused. Harry, the ministry visit. The filing vector made this morning is accurate and necessary and in the official record, Harry said. Yes. He stood. Good night, Professor. He walked back down the moving stairs with the brand warm on his arm and the clear, settled feeling of someone who has moved something important from one position to another, and outside Dumbledore's office the castle was night dark and cold and going about its own business, and the problem of Rodolphus Lestrange Jr. was, if not solved, at least named. Named was the first step. Harry had learned that early, in the cupboard, with the ruler, measuring the exact shape of containment. You named things. You measured them. And then you knew what you were working with. Chapter 5, The Burning and the Ice. Lestrange was gone from the castle by Saturday morning. Harry knew because the brand told him, in its indirect way, the ambient quality of the castle's magical atmosphere shifted slightly, the way a room feels different when someone who was making noise stops. He confirmed it through Hermione, who had been watching the visiting academic registry that Vector had quietly made available to her, and who reported at breakfast on Saturday that Rodolphus Lestrange Jr.'s name had been removed from the active access list sometime between midnight and 6 in the morning. Dumbledore had moved fast. That was information too. The Lestrange removal should have settled things for a while. Harry had expected a period of recalibration, the ministry visit in progress, the jurisdiction question unresolved, Malfoy's plans disrupted by the compulsion incident becoming documented. A few weeks of relative quiet in which he and Daphne could consolidate what they knew and Vector could manage the formal process. What he had not accounted for was Draco deciding that a moment of apparent weakness was a moment to act. He found out about it the way he found out about most things, not from being told, but from paying attention. Sunday morning. He was in the corridor outside the Great Hall heading to breakfast when he passed close enough to a cluster of fourth-year Slytherins to catch fragments of a conversation they hadn't bothered to lower their voices for, because the people in it had clearly decided the outcome was inevitable. He caught Daphne's name. He caught his own name. He caught the phrase formal petition to the headmaster and the Greengrass family has indicated and traditional obligation precedent. He walked past them without slowing and went directly to breakfast and sat down and thought about it while Ron talked about Quidditch with the focused passion of someone who considered Saturday morning the appropriate time for this. Traditional obligation precedent. That was the specific legal language. He knew it from the statute research Daphne had been doing. There was a section in the 1897 amendment to the Bonding Regulation Act that Daphne had flagged and then set aside as low probability, because it required the active cooperation of a parent or guardian. The section allowed a third party with a documented traditional claim over one of the bonded individuals to petition for formal review of the bond's legitimacy on the grounds of prior social obligation. It was an archaic provision, left in from a century when arranged betrothals were enforced through legal architecture, and it had been used exactly once in the last 50 years. The Greengrass family has indicated. He was out of the Great Hall before Ron noticed he'd gone. Daphne was not in the library. She was not in any of the places they usually worked. He found her eventually through the brand, following the warmth the way you follow a sound, through 3 corridors and up a back staircase to a small room near the Charms corridor that had a window seat and a locked door and was, he suspected, a place she had found in her first week of castle mapping and kept entirely to herself. He knocked. There was a silence. Then the lock clicked. She was sitting in the window seat with her knees drawn up and a letter in her hands and her composure, for the first time since he had known her, completely, entirely down. Not visibly distressed in a dramatic way. More the way a highly controlled person looks when they have temporarily stopped spending energy on control, which was in some ways more striking than visible distress. He came in. Sat in the chair across from her. Waited. "My father," she said. He kept his face still. "He sent a letter last night." She looked at the parchment in her hands. Lucius Malfoy went to him in person on Friday evening. After the ministry visit. He laid out the traditional obligation precedent in full and told my father that the correct thing, the right thing, for the family, for the social standing, for the existing understanding between the houses, was to file a formal petition. She paused. He told my father that the sole bond between me and Harry Potter was a destabilizing element in existing social structures and that allowing it to develop without oversight was irresponsible. "And your father?" Harry said quietly. "Wrote to tell me that he refused." She looked up. Her eyes were dry but the muscles around them were doing something controlled and effortful. "He refused completely and told Malfoy to stay out of his daughter's business." A pause. "And then he wrote to tell me because he said I had a right to know that the conversation had happened and what had been said." Harry looked at her. She was angry, he could see it clearly now, under the composure, the real and genuine anger of someone who has had their life discussed as a political variable by a man who had nothing to do with it. "Lucius Malfoy went to your father in person," he said. "Friday evening," she said. "The same day Thorn was here. The same day Lestrange was removed." She set the letter down with careful movements. He's been operating on 2 tracks simultaneously. The ministry track, the referral, the compulsion attempt, the jurisdiction question, and the family track. When the ministry track started to collapse, he moved harder on the family track. And the formal petition, Harry said. Draco's filing one. She looked at him sharply. I heard fragments in the corridor this morning, he said. 4th-year Slytherins. Traditional obligation precedent. Draco's taking it to Dumbledore. Something moved through her face. He can't file without my father's support, she said. The provision requires your father's support or a claim of parental dereliction of duty regarding established traditional obligations, Harry said. If Malfoy argues that your father's refusal to honor the Malfoy-Greengrass understanding constitutes a failure of traditional stewardship, that's an extraordinary stretch. It's Lucius Malfoy, Harry said. He'll stretch it. She was quiet for a moment. Thinking. He could see the process, rapid, thorough, all the angles. Then she said, Dumbledore won't honor it. No, Harry said. Dumbledore won't honor it because Dumbledore wants to manage us himself, and handing management to Lucius Malfoy is not what he wants. He paused. But the petition being filed puts the bond in front of Dumbledore officially and gives him a reason to intervene. Draco knows that. Malfoy knows that. They're using Dumbledore as a tool. They're trying to create institutional pressure from 2 directions simultaneously, Daphne said slowly. Malfoy filing the petition forces Dumbledore to address it. Dumbledore addressing it forces him to take a position on the bond. And once he takes a position, there's precedent for oversight. And the brand, Harry said, can burn out magical interference all day. But legal and institutional interference operates differently. They looked at each other. The window behind her showed the December grounds, snow now, heavy and white, the black lake invisible under a flat grey sky. The room was small and quiet and very cold because the castle's heating charms didn't extend reliably to the smaller side rooms, and Harry could see her breath faintly in the air. We need to do something they won't expect, Harry said. Define unexpected. Not defensive. Not responsive. He turned the problem over in his mind. They're expecting us to fight the petition. To argue the jurisdiction question, to lean on Gale, to work through Vector's monograph and the legal response. Because that's the defensive play. That's the play of people protecting something. We're not protecting something, Daphne said, slowly, reading where he was going. No. We're not. He leaned forward. The petition, if Draco files it with Dumbledore, what does Dumbledore have to do with it? Review it. Convene a discussion with relevant parties. Theoretically, he has to convene a discussion with relevant parties, Harry said. Which means we're in the room. Both of us. With Dumbledore and Draco and whoever Malfoy sends as his representative. She looked at him. You want to use the petition hearing. I want to use the petition hearing to put everything we know in front of Dumbledore in a formal setting that he can't manage around the edges, Harry said. The compulsion incidents. The Lestrange access. The ministry referral source. The traditional obligation precedents legal requirements, which Gale can demolish in about 4 sentences because your father hasn't cooperated and there's no standing claim, and then Vector's monograph, submitted into the record of the hearing itself. Daphne was very still. The hearing becomes the record, Harry said. Formal, documented, with Dumbledore as witness. And in that record is everything. Every attempt to interfere. Every compulsion. Every institutional manipulation. All of it, in front of the one person in this castle who has enough authority to do something about it and who, if we make it public enough, official enough, cannot choose not to. She looked at him for a long time. He watched her work through it, every angle, every risk. Her eyes were doing the rapid quality of someone who sees the shape of a strategy and is stress testing it. He'll know what we're doing, she said finally. Yes. He'll resent it. He might. But he'll be in a position where resenting it and acting on that resentment makes him look complicit in everything Malfoy did. Harry met her gaze. Dumbledore cares very much about how he looks. Not vainly, he genuinely believes that his authority is in service of good things. If we put him in a position where defending his authority requires him to endorse a campaign of compulsion against 2 11-year-olds, he won't do it. She absorbed this. The anger was still visible underneath, the clean, real anger at Malfoy, at the conversation her father had been subjected to, at the whole structure of people deciding things about her, but it had found a shape. It had found something to go into. "When does Draco file?" she said. "Based on what I heard this morning, probably today or tomorrow. Then we have hours." She unfolded her legs and stood, which in the small space put her closer to him than they usually stood, and neither of them moved back. "I need to write to Gale. You need to tell Hermione to prepare a formal presentation of the compulsion documentation. And we need to speak to Vector about having her appear at the hearing in person." "Yes," Harry said. "And Pansy," she said. "She needs to know what's happening before Draco tells everyone his version." "What will she do?" "She'll back me," Daphne said, with simple certainty. "She doesn't agree with the political content but she understands loyalty and she's my friend, and when Draco has been pushing this she's been," a small pause, "quietly difficult for him." "Good," Harry said. She was already moving toward the door. "Harry." She stopped without turning. "What you said last week. About Dumbledore using the petition as a reason to intervene, you're right, but there's something else in it too." "What?" She turned. Her composure was back up but there was something underneath it that was more present, more personal, than the analytical version of her that worked through problems at the library table. "He genuinely believes the bond should be managed. Not destroyed, he's not Malfoy. But guided. Shaped toward the outcome he's already decided it should produce." She held his gaze. "He'll try to use the hearing to establish himself as a benevolent authority over it. To be the reasonable adult who stepped in and handled things properly." Harry looked at her. "And we're going to let him think that's what's happening." Something crossed her face, there and gone, the quick match flame of a real smile, the one she didn't use for social purposes. "Until we don't need to." He almost laughed. "Almost. Go right to Gale. You go tell Hermione." They left the small cold room in different directions, and the brand was warm on both their arms, and somewhere in the castle Draco Malfoy was either already filing his petition or working himself up to it, and neither of them was worried. Draco filed Monday morning. Harry found out from McGonagall, who called him to her office before breakfast with the expression of a woman who has received information she finds deeply objectionable and is choosing her response with great care. She told him a formal petition had been lodged under the traditional obligation precedent, that the headmaster was convening a review meeting for Wednesday afternoon, and that Harry was entitled to have a faculty advocate present. "I'd like you," Harry said. Something moved across McGonagall's face. "Me. You know the situation as well as any staff member. You know what happened in the corridor in October. And you'll be honest about what you see, which is what I need from an advocate." She looked at him for a moment. The mouth was in its firm line. "Then, I'll be there," she said. "And Harry, the petition has no standing without the cooperation of the Greengrass family, which I understand has been explicitly withheld." "I know," Harry said. "The petition has no legal standing. But the hearing exists and that's what matters." She gave him the evaluating look. "What are you planning?" "To put everything in front of the headmaster officially," he said. "All of it?" McGonagall was quiet for a moment. He had the impression she was choosing between several responses and selecting the one that was simultaneously honest and not a breach of professional conduct. "I will say this," she said carefully. "The headmaster has had information available to him since October that he has not acted on with the directness the situation warranted. She looked at her desk. Having that information formally on the record of an official hearing is not the worst outcome. Harry nodded. Wednesday, he said. I'll be ready. He spent Monday and Tuesday in a focused, unhurried preparation that felt less like cramming for an exam and more like packing for a journey he had been planning for months. Hermione produced a formal documentation package for the compulsion incidents, the October corridor event, the December restricted section event, with signature analyses, timeline correlations, and a clear lay summary written in language accessible to someone without specialist magical training, because Thorn might be there and clarity was an advantage. Vector confirmed she would attend in person and bring her own copy of the monograph with its formal academic record. Gale sent Daphne a briefing document on the traditional obligation precedent standing requirements, which was concise and devastating, 3 statutory conditions, none of which were met, one of which required the cooperation of a living parent who had formally communicated his refusal in writing. Daphne worked through her own preparation with the thoroughness of someone who had been ready for a confrontation since it was first made inevitable, which was approximately the moment Lucius Malfoy walked into her father's house on Friday evening and made the mistake of treating her father like an instrument. They met in the library Tuesday evening, compared notes, identified gaps, filled them. They worked for 3 hours with the comfortable efficiency of people who have been working together long enough to not waste time on overlap. Hermione sat at the end of the table doing her own cross-referencing and occasionally sliding relevant parchments toward one or both of them without being asked. At 9 o'clock, with an hour until curfew, Harry set down his quill and looked at the work spread across the table and felt the quality of readiness, the specific weight of having done everything you could do in the time available. "We're ready," Hermione said, from her end of the table. "Yes," Daphne said. Harry looked at her. She looked at him. There was something between them that was not nervousness, neither of them was nervous, which was notable, but something with energy in it, something forward-leaning. He thought about what the brand was and what it was for, about governing logic and structural rules and the old compact's patience across centuries, and he thought about a 31-inch cupboard and a manor library and 2 9-year-olds being marked in the dark by something that had been paying very careful attention. "Whatever happens Wednesday," he said, "this is ours. What we're carrying. No one gets to define it except us." Daphne looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Yes," and it was the same word she always used when she agreed with something completely but wanted it on the record that she had chosen to agree. Wednesday came down grey and cold and entirely indifferent to the significance of what was happening in a first-floor meeting room at 2 in the afternoon. Dumbledore had arranged the room himself, which told Harry something about how seriously he was taking it. Round table, chairs for 8, no obvious hierarchy of positioning, though the headmaster's chair was slightly more substantial than the others in a way that suggested its occupant was accustomed to such distinctions. The fire was lit. Tea had been provided. Everything about the arrangement said we are reasonable people having a reasonable conversation, and Harry found it professionally impressive. Present, Dumbledore. McGonagall. Harry. Daphne, with Pansy behind her in an observer's seat that Daphne had specifically requested because, as she had told Harry, having a witness from Slytherin in the room was political positioning as much as support. Vector, calm and slightly metallic, with a copy of her monograph in front of her. Gale, the solicitor, in person this time rather than mirror, a small, dry-voiced man in his 60s who had the quality of someone who had been in rooms like this many times and found them moderately interesting. Draco, across the table, with a Malfoy family representative Harry didn't know, a man named Aldrich Selwyn, smooth-faced and careful. And Thorn, the ministry official, who had apparently requested permission to observe and been granted it. Draco looked at the assembled room and had the expression of someone who had expected a smaller gathering. Dumbledore opened the meeting with the benevolent precision of an expert chair, acknowledging the petition, outlining the formal process, establishing the reasonable tone. Harry let him do it. The process had standing and deserved its process. Then Gale spoke for 4 minutes and demonstrated with complete legal clarity that the traditional obligation petition had no statutory foundation, 3 criteria, none met, the Greengrass parental cooperation requirement failed by the father's written refusal, dated and witnessed and submitted to Gale's firm as a formal legal record. The petition was, in standing terms, an empty document. Selwyn began to argue the parental dereliction angle. Gale gave him 45 seconds and then said, "The elder Mr. Greengrass has provided documented communication of his refusal. The dereliction argument requires the absence of parental guidance, not the presence of parental guidance the petitioner disagrees with. These are substantially different legal positions and I would be surprised if Mr. Selwyn is genuinely unaware of the distinction." Selwyn went quiet. Draco looked at his advocate with an expression that said this was not what he'd been told to expect. "Thank you, Mr. Gale," Dumbledore said, with the smoothness of a man adjusting course. "In light of these points, the petition as filed has insufficient standing to proceed." However, he looked around the table with the warm, considered authority of a man about to be reasonable. "The events that prompted the petition are real and documented and the school has an obligation to address them properly. I think this meeting is an opportunity to do that." Harry looked at Dumbledore. This was the pivot, the headmaster abandoning the petition framing and moving to the management framing. The concern for student welfare. The reasonable adult establishing oversight. He had expected it. He let it reach its full extension. "I agree," Harry said. Dumbledore looked at him, slightly surprised by the agreement. "The events are documented and they should be on the record," Harry said. "Hermione, would you present the compulsion documentation?" Hermione, who had been sitting very straight and very ready for approximately 40 minutes, opened her folder. She presented with the systematic clarity of someone who had rehearsed and also simply knew the material cold: the October corridor incident, the signature analysis, Fleur Delacour's confirmation that the Veela aura had been ambient and non-deliberate. Then the December restricted section incident. The professional grade signature. The ministry interrogation class classification. The correlation with Rodolphus Lestrange Jr.'s presence in the castle that day. The room was very quiet when she finished. Thorn was writing something in his notebook. McGonagall's face had gone to a stillness that Harry recognized as carefully controlled fury. Selwyn had stopped performing composure. Draco was looking at the table. Dumbledore said, "The Lestrange situation has been addressed. He is no longer in the castle." "Yes," Harry said. "You handled that quickly, which I appreciate. But the documentation exists, and the ministry official present," he nodded to Thorn, "now has it formally on the record of this hearing." He looked at Dumbledore directly. "Which means the investigation into who directed Lestrange to use ministry-grade compulsion on a first-year student is no longer an internal school matter." Dumbledore looked at him. The deep blue eyes were very still. "Harry, Professor Vector," Harry said. "Would you speak to the classification question?" Vector spoke for 8 minutes. She was precise and thorough and entirely comfortable in a room full of powerful people, and she laid out the pre-framework classification of the governing logic with the authority of someone who had spent 17 years being certain she was right and was finally being invited to demonstrate it. The old compact as a structural rule. The recognition marks as expressions of that rule, not events within the framework but rules the framework ran on top of. The jurisdiction question for the Bonding Regulation Act. Her language was careful and technical and completely unambiguous. When she finished, Thorn said, "That's consistent with my preliminary review of the filing. I'll be recommending to the department that the 1722 Act's jurisdiction does not extend to this situation." He made another note. "The investigation into the compulsion incident is a separate matter and will be handled through the Department of Magical Law Enforcement." Selwyn said, carefully, "The compulsion incident is an unproven allegation. It's a documented magical signature with academic confirmation and temporal correlation," Hermione said, from her observer position, with the calm certainty of someone who has checked her work 3 times. Nobody told her she hadn't been invited to speak. Dumbledore looked around the table. He looked at Draco, who was not looking at him. He looked at Selwyn, whose composure had thinned to something technical. He looked at Harry and Daphne, sitting across the table from each other with their notes and their documents and their two entirely composed expressions, and he looked at the round table he had arranged and the reasonable meeting he had intended to chair, and Harry could see, clearly, with the specific clarity of someone who has been paying close attention, the moment the headmaster understood what had happened. He had given them the room. And they had used it. "I think," Dumbledore said, after a measured pause, "that we have accomplished what we needed to accomplish this afternoon." He looked at Draco. "The petition is withdrawn for lack of standing." He looked at Thorn. "The Ministry will handle the compulsion investigation through appropriate channels." He looked at Harry and Daphne with an expression that was, underneath the benevolent surface, more complex than anything he had shown before. Something that was not quite respect and not quite frustration, and was perhaps the closest this particular man came to genuine surprise. "And the students involved will continue their work here under the school's protection, as all students are entitled to." "Thank you, Headmaster," Harry said. The meeting ended with the precise, controlled quality of something that has been concluded rather than finished. People gathered papers. Conversations resumed in lower registers. Thorn caught Harry's eye on the way out and nodded once, brief, professional, and full of something that might have been approval. Selwyn left quickly, with Draco behind him. At the door, Draco stopped and looked back at Harry, a long look, complicated and personal. Harry held it. After a moment, Draco said, very quietly, "My father is going to be." "I know," Harry said. "He doesn't." Draco stopped. The performing composure was completely down, and what was underneath was a 17-years young face that was tired and complicated and operating under a weight that had been placed on it before he was old enough to have asked for it. "He doesn't forgive things." "I know," Harry said again. "Neither do I." He held Draco's gaze. "But I don't pursue them either. We can be done with this or we can keep going." "That's actually your choice, Draco." "Not his." Draco looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned and left, and his footsteps went down the corridor with the sound of someone who had not decided anything yet. McGonagall appeared at Harry's shoulder. She was looking at the doorway through which the Malfoy contingent had departed with the expression of someone who has stored several hours of controlled fury and is now privately releasing it. "Well handled," she said, in a voice that suggested the compliment was costing her very little because it was simply accurate. "Thank you for being here," Harry said. She made a small sound. "Go on," she said. "Both of you." He walked out into the corridor. Daphne was already there, a few feet away, her notes tucked under her arm, Pansy at her shoulder making quiet, rapid commentary that Daphne was listening to with the patient expression of someone allowing a debrief. The brand was warm with the specific quality it had after something significant, not brighter, exactly, but fuller, like something that had been held compressed and was now simply itself. Pansy finished her commentary, looked at Harry, and said to Daphne, "I'm going to go be elsewhere now," and left with the precision of someone who has excellent social timing. Daphne watched her go. Then she looked at Harry. They were alone in the first-floor corridor with the afternoon light coming in long and pale through the far window, and the hearing was over and the petition was dead and the Ministry investigation was moving and Dumbledore had been maneuvered into a position from which managing them quietly was significantly harder than it had been on Tuesday. "We did that," Harry said. "We did," Daphne said. He looked at her. She looked at him. The brand was warm on both their arms, the steady compass and flame pulse of something that had been marking them since they were 9 years old and waiting, with enormous patience, for them to grow into what it already knew they were. "You should know," Harry said, "that I meant what I said on Sunday. It doesn't matter what Malfoy thinks it is or what Dumbledore wants it to be. This is ours and we define it." Daphne looked at him for a moment with the full force of her composed grey eyes and the warmth underneath them that she no longer spent all her energy hiding from him, because he had been reading around the edges of her composure for 4 months and she had stopped pretending he couldn't. "Yes," she said. And then, Because she was Daphne Greengrass and she had spent 4 months being absolutely precise about everything, she said, "I'm aware that I have been progressively less careful about the edges of certain things when you're in the room." Harry looked at her. "Yes," he said. "I know. That's inconvenient," she said. "Extremely," he agreed. Something that was absolutely a smile crossed her face, not the quick match flame, not the controlled professional version, but something real and slightly reluctant and entirely unguarded, and it lasted long enough to be seen clearly, which was the most honest thing she had done in front of him yet. Then her composure came back up, but softer this time, the way a door stays open instead of closing. She turned toward the corridor that led toward the dungeons. "Same time Thursday," she said. "Same time Thursday," he said. He watched her walk away, and the brand was warm and the old magic was patient and the castle around them was full of everything that was still coming, and Harry Potter stood in the first-floor corridor with his notes and his composure and the absolutely certain feeling of someone who is standing exactly where they're supposed to be. Chapter 6, Equal and Chosen. January came to Hogwarts with the specific cruelty of a Scottish winter that had been holding back and decided to stop. The castle groaned in the wind at night, and the Black Lake froze at the edges for the first time in 3 years according to Ron, who had sources for this kind of information the way other people had sources for political news. The corridors were cold in the mornings and the common room fire was the only reasonable location until 10, and Harry spent the first week back from the Christmas holidays reacclimating to stone floors and drafts and the particular quality of Hogwarts cold that felt somehow less hostile than the cold at Privet Drive, because the castle was indifferent rather than deliberate. He had spent Christmas at the Weasleys', which Mrs. Weasley had arranged with the combined force of maternal warmth and logistical efficiency that apparently characterized everything she did, and it had been the first Christmas of his life that had felt like the word Christmas was supposed to mean. He had eaten too much and sat by the fire reading and let Fred and George drag him into increasingly questionable experiments with holiday crackers and thought about the hearings and the ministry and Dumbledore and the shape of what came next. He had also thought about Daphne, who had written him one letter from the Greengrass Manor over the holiday. 2 pages, precise and thorough, updating him on a conversation with her father and 3 new texts from the family archive and a specific paragraph in Vector's monograph that she had found a potential legal amplification for. No personal content whatsoever. He had read it 4 times. He had written back 7 paragraphs of research notes and at the end, in different ink because he had put the letter down and picked it back up, added, "I hope your Christmas was good. I hope Astoria is well. I hope the manor is warm." She had not written again before term, which he chose not to analyze. She was back at breakfast on the first Monday of term, at the Slytherin table, eating with her characteristic precision, and when the mail arrived she looked toward the Gryffindor table for exactly 1 second before looking away, and the brand was warm, and Harry spread marmalade on his toast and decided that things were proceeding as they should. The ministry's investigation had moved over the holiday. Thorne had sent a formal communication to Hogwarts in the last week of December, official language, all institutional propriety, informing the headmaster that the investigation into the December compulsion incident had produced findings consistent with the documentation submitted at the hearing and that the Department of Magical Law Enforcement was proceeding accordingly. No name mentioned. No specific charge laid. But the letter had gone to Dumbledore and McGonagall and to Gale's firm, and that was a circle of knowledge that meant things moving in official channels. Lucius Malfoy had gone very quiet. Harry noted this the way he noted everything, as a data point with implications. A loud man going quiet was not a man who had stopped. It was a man who had switched methods. He was thinking about this on the second Tuesday of term when Dumbledore asked to see him. The headmaster's office in January had the particular quality of a space that was warm and inhabited and full of living things, the portraits murmuring, the instruments turning softly on their shelves, Fawkes the Phoenix on his perch watching Harry with the bright steady attention of a creature that has been alive long enough to find most things interesting. Dumbledore was behind his desk, and on the desk was Vector's monograph, the formal submission copy with the Division of Magical Governance stamp on the cover. Harry sat. Waited. "I owe you an apology, Harry," Dumbledore said. This was not how Harry had expected the conversation to begin. He kept his face still and his attention sharp and let the words sit without responding immediately. "I kept Professor Vector's monograph from official circulation," Dumbledore said, "because I was concerned about how the information it contained would be used. That concern was legitimate. My method of addressing it was not." He looked at the monograph. "I told myself I was protecting the information until it was needed. What I was actually doing was protecting my ability to manage the situation when it arose." Harry looked at him. Dumbledore was watching him with those deep blue eyes that were doing something Harry hadn't seen them do before, something unguarded. Not entirely, not as unguarded as Draco in the corridor had been, because Dumbledore had more practice and more layers and more history. But genuinely less managed than usual. "I know," Harry said. "Yes," Dumbledore said. "I imagine you do." A pause. "You are a remarkable boy, Harry. You have been, since the moment you walked into this school, more prepared than anyone anticipated. More prepared than I anticipated." He said this with a quality that was not entirely comfortable, which Harry found more credible than if it had been easy. "I had a plan for how this year would go. How I would guide you. What you would learn and when, and how I would ensure you were ready for what comes later. And we didn't fit the plan," Harry said. "You and Miss Greengrass have operated with an autonomy and a sophistication that I did not build into my thinking." He was honest about it in a way that cost him something. "I am not accustomed to being outmaneuvered by first years." "We weren't trying to outmaneuver you," Harry said. "We were trying to define ourselves before anyone else did it for us." Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. "That is perhaps the most important distinction." "What happens now?" Harry said. "The Ministry investigation proceeds," Dumbledore said. "The jurisdiction question for the bond is settled, formally. The petition is closed." He folded his hands. "What happens now, I think, is that you continue doing what you have been doing, researching, learning, developing, and I try to be more transparent about what I know and less inclined to manage what I think I should be allowing to develop on its own." Harry looked at him. He looked for a long time, the way he had looked at Thorn and at Draco, looking for the performance layer and the thing underneath. What he found in Dumbledore was something genuinely complex. A man who was accustomed to being the wisest person in any given room, who had organized the world around that expectation for decades, and who was sitting now with a partial acknowledgement of error that was real but also carefully bounded. He was not saying "I will stop managing things." He was saying "I will manage things differently." Harry understood this. He accepted it with the clarity of someone who knows that perfect transparency from Dumbledore was not available and probably never would be, and that a partial acknowledgement from a man who rarely acknowledged anything was worth taking seriously. "I appreciate you telling me this," Harry said. "I am not finished earning that appreciation," Dumbledore said, with a quality that was almost wry. "No," Harry said. "But this is a start." He left the headmaster's office with the brand warm and steady and the feeling of something shifting, not dramatically, not with the energy of the hearing room, but with the quieter shift of a long-held position beginning to change. Dumbledore was not a solved problem. He was an ongoing negotiation, and the negotiation had just moved to a slightly more honest register. That was enough for January. Hermione found him in the library that evening with 3 books and the expression of someone who has connected something. "The 1423 Volkov case," she said, sitting down without ceremony and putting the books in front of him. "The notation in the Greengrass family text, you remember, the one about the caster losing their magic entirely when they tried to compel the marked pair." "Yes. I've been cross-referencing it against Vector's monograph, Section 8 specifically, and there's an implication that I think neither you nor Daphne has fully addressed." She opened one of the books to a flagged page. "The brand burns out external influence directed at either of you individually. But Vector's Section 8 describes what happens when both marked individuals are simultaneously present and the bond is, her word is resonant. When you're both present and the connection is active, the correction capacity multiplies. Harry looked at the page. By how much? Geometrically, Hermione said. Not just doubled. The Volkov notation says the caster lost their magic entirely after casting what was described as a moderate compulsion, which is consistent with a multiplied correction releasing substantially more energy than a single-person correction would. We've never been in the same place when something was cast, Harry said slowly. The October corridor incident, Daphne was there, but she wasn't directly involved in the Veela aura event. The compulsion attempts after that were when you were alone. She looked at him. Harry, if someone were to cast something significant at both of you simultaneously, the correction would be significantly more powerful than anything we've seen so far, Harry said. More than significantly. She closed the book. I'm not saying this to worry you. I'm saying it because whoever is still operating, and we don't know that the Lestrange incident was the last attempt, might eventually work out that the safest way to approach this is separately. Keep you apart. Harry looked at the table. Thought about the hearing and Dumbledore's pivot toward management and Malfoy going quiet. Thought about the specific political logic of keeping him and Daphne in separate institutional tracks, separate conversations, separate processes. Separation is the strategy, he said. Not compulsion. Not petition. Keep us in separate rooms, separate conversations. Let the institutions handle each of us individually where the brand can't multiply. It's what I would do, Hermione said, with the honest directness of someone who has just admitted something slightly alarming about their own tactical thinking. If I were trying to manage you. Harry was quiet for a moment. Then he stood up, picked up his bag. I need to talk to Daphne. It's past curfew. I know. She looked at him. Do you want me to come? No. Stay. If a prefect comes looking, tell them I'm getting water from the common room. That's an implausible lie. Tell them I'm getting water anyway, he said, and was out the library door before she could argue further. He found Daphne in the Slytherin common room corridor rather than the room itself. She had apparently been heading somewhere with the same focus quality of someone who has just worked out something important and is moving on it. They nearly collided at the corner where the corridor that led to the back stairs met the corridor that led to the library. They both stopped. The Section 8 implication, she said. Hermione just told me, he said. I worked it out this afternoon and was coming to find you. She looked at him in the dim corridor with the torchlight doing something interesting to the planes of her face. Separation is the play. Keep us in different rooms. Individual tracks. Yes. Which means every institutional process that's currently in motion, she stopped. Worked through it. The Ministry investigation. Gale's legal framework. Even Vector's formal submission. Each of those has us addressed separately. Our information goes in through different channels. Our advocates communicate with different departments. We've been thorough individually, Harry said. We need to be visible jointly. Visible jointly, she said, and he could hear her working out what that meant. The two of us, in the same space, presenting the same information simultaneously through the same process. Not separately filing with Gale and Thorn. A single joint communication. A single record that has both our names at the top and both our positions stated in the same document. She looked at him. That's more exposure. Yes. But it's the right kind. Every time we've been exposed, the corridor, the hearing, we've come out ahead because we had the information and the preparation and because the brand being active in a shared space is a demonstration in itself. You want to request a formal joint meeting with Thorn, she said. Not his visit to the school. Our request. Our terms. With Vector present. With Gale present. With everything from the investigation so far included. A comprehensive joint record of the full situation from both our perspectives simultaneously. He held her gaze. And after that meeting is on the official record, separating us institutionally becomes substantially harder because we're already documented as a unit. Daphne was quiet for a moment. The corridor was cold and very still, and outside the nearest window the January dark was pressed flat against the glass. "My father will want to be involved," she said finally. "That's fine. Better than fine. Having your father on record as supportive removes the dereliction angle permanently. He'll actually want to meet you," she said, and there was a particular quality in her voice that was not entirely analytical. Harry looked at her. "I know. He's not Lucius Malfoy. He's not going to test you or perform authority at you." She paused. "He's going to want to know who you are. Then I'll tell him." She held his gaze for a moment. "He'll ask about the Dursleys." Something shifted in Harry's chest, the small, familiar compression of a thing he didn't discuss with most people. He had mentioned the cupboard to Vector in passing, and that single fragment had sat between them without expanding into a full picture. He looked at Daphne and understood, with absolute clarity, that she had known the shape of the full picture for a while, had inferred it from the 31-inch comment and from the way he talked about measuring things and from the particular quality of his ease in the castle compared to his ease almost nowhere else, and had never asked directly because she understood privacy by instinct the same way he did. "I'll tell him that too," Harry said. "If he asks." She looked at him for a long moment with the full force of her grey eyes and the warmth underneath that she had stopped pretending he couldn't see. "You are the least hidden person I know," she said, which was an extraordinary thing to say to someone who wore long sleeves over a glowing mark and said very little about himself to most people. "You see around the edges," he said. "Yes." A pause. "So do you." They stood in the corridor for a moment that had a specific quality of balance in it, two people who had been circling the same center for 4 months, getting closer by deliberate increments, and who had arrived at a point where the distance between them was small enough to be a choice rather than a circumstance. "Thursday," she said. "Thursday," he agreed. But he said it differently than he had before, not as a library meeting, not as a research session. As something that had its own name that neither of them had said out loud yet. She looked at him for one more second with something completely unguarded, and then she turned and walked back to the dungeons. He stood in the corridor until her footsteps faded, and then he stood for a moment longer, and the brand was the warmest it had ever been, not burning, not blazing, just deeply, thoroughly warm, the way things are warm when they have arrived where they were always going. The joint meeting with Thorne happened on the last Friday of January. Harry's father, he was still working out what that word meant in the context of James Potter, who was a photograph and a story and a shape of absence, had left him something, apparently, in the legal architecture of wizarding inheritance, enough of a trust to cover school supplies and nothing else, administered by the bank, untouched because nobody had thought to tell him it existed until Gale mentioned it in passing. But more relevantly, the Potter family name had standing in the ministry's formal records, and standing mattered in rooms like this. Daphne's father came down from the manor on Thursday evening and was in the Three Broomsticks when Harry arrived with McGonagall at 8, which was slightly past the point where any of this could technically be called a school-supervised event, but McGonagall had the expression of a woman who had decided that the rules she was bending were worth bending. Flavian Greengrass was tall, with the same precise quality his daughter had, and the same grey eyes, and when he stood to shake Harry's hand he did it with the straightforward manner of someone who had already decided the person they were meeting was worth meeting and was now just confirming details. "Mr. Potter," he said. "My daughter writes about you with considerable restraint." McGonagall made a small sound from behind Harry. "Sir," Harry said. "She says you're organized and thorough and unervingly calm," Flavian said. "I'm going to take the unervingly calm part as a positive indicator." He gestured to the seat across from him. "Sit. Tell me about the Dursleys." Harry sat. He told him. Not everything, not the full catalogue, not the specific measurements or the specific quality of hunger or the specific texture of being unwanted so thoroughly that it had become unremarkable. But the shape of it. The outline. Enough. Flavian listened without expression. At the end he was quiet for a moment, and his quiet had the same quality Daphne's did, processing and concluding, not performing response. Then he said, "That will not continue after this year." It was stated as fact, not promise. Harry looked at him. "I know," he said. Flavian nodded once. "Then, tell me what you need from me at the meeting tomorrow." They worked through it for an hour while McGonagall drank tea and contributed precise, useful observations whenever the conversation touched on school policy. Gale arrived at 9, sharp-eyed and efficient. By 10 they had the joint filing framework settled and Harry walked back to the castle through January cold with his breath making small clouds and the brand warm and steady on his arm. The meeting with Thorn was not in the school this time. Thorn had arranged a room at the ministry's regional office in Edinburgh, neutral ground, official, with a formal record-keeper present. Harry and Daphne sat side by side at the table for the first time in any official setting, with Flavian Greengrass to Daphne's left and McGonagall to Harry's right and Gale at the end and Vector beside him and Thorn across the table with two ministry colleagues whose job was to ensure the record was complete and accurate. The brand, with both of them present, was resonant. Harry felt it the moment they sat down, the quality Hermione had described from Vector's Section 8, the multiplied warmth, the deep-settled pulse of two half-systems operating as a complete one. Not overwhelming. Not dramatic. Just thorough, in the way that very fundamental things are thorough. Thorn looked at the two of them and made a small note in his folder and didn't say anything about it, which Harry appreciated. The meeting lasted 3 hours. Gale and Vector presented the formal joint record, the complete documented history, from the October corridor through the December compulsion incident through the petition hearing through the investigation's current status, presented as a unified narrative with both Harry and Daphne named as joint principals throughout. The legal framework for the pre-framework classification. The jurisdiction question formally resolved. The investigation findings, which Thorn confirmed had produced enough evidence to refer the compulsion matter for prosecution. He didn't say Lestrange's name but the referral was on the record and the record would eventually be public. Then Harry spoke. He had thought carefully about what he wanted to say in this room, not prepared in the sense of rehearsed, but prepared in the sense of having been clear with himself about what mattered. He said that the old compact's marks had been on their arms for 2 years before they arrived at school. That in those 2 years nothing had been explained, documented, or made available to them, and that the absence of information had created the vulnerability that the compulsion attempts had exploited. That the purpose of this meeting was not to close a chapter but to open a process, ongoing documentation, clear legal status, and the formal acknowledgement that what they were carrying was theirs and operated under their autonomy. Daphne spoke after him with the precision of a surgeon and the composure of someone who had been preparing for a version of this her whole life. She said the same things Harry had said from a different angle, and the two angles together made the full picture clear in a way that neither alone would have. She said that the institutions of the wizarding world had a poor historical record with recognition marks because they had always attempted to manage what was, by fundamental definition, unmanageable. That the correct institutional response was not oversight but protection, protection of the pair's autonomy, their research access, their legal standing. And that the ministry's formal acknowledgement of the pre-framework classification was the first step toward getting that response right. Thorn listened to both of them with the attentive stillness of a man hearing something he is going to spend a long time thinking about. When they were done he was quiet for a moment. "I'll be honest with both of you," he said. "The Division of Magical Governance doesn't have good frameworks for this situation. The 1722 Act is clearly inapplicable and the pre-framework classification creates a regulatory gap that we are not equipped to fill on short notice." He looked at them directly. "What I can offer is a formal declaration of protected status under the Ministry's non-standard magical events provisions, which gives you legal standing to refuse any registration, regulation, or institutional oversight mandate that references the bond specifically. It doesn't give you everything you've outlined. But it gives you the floor." Harry looked at Daphne. She looked at him. The brand was warm and resonant and completely unbothered by the fact that they were in a ministry room in Edinburgh with record keepers and officials and the full weight of institutional process around them, because it was a very old thing and it had been waiting for 600 years, and a few hours in a regional office was not going to change what it knew. "We'll take the floor," Harry said. "Yes," Daphne said. They came back to Hogwarts in the early evening, the Edinburgh winter dark already full by 5 o'clock, and the castle lit up warm at the end of the walk from the gates. Flavian Greengrass had returned to the manor after walking with them to the Hogwarts grounds and shaking Harry's hand again at the gate, a longer handshake than the first, with something in it that Harry understood and accepted without requiring it to be spoken. McGonagall peeled away at the entrance hall doors, heading toward the staff corridor with the quality of someone who has done a significant thing and intends to note it in the records and then drink tea quietly. She paused at the corridor's mouth and looked back at both of them with the expression she used for students who had done something she found genuinely excellent and was willing to acknowledge without fanfare. "Well done," she said, and went. Harry and Daphne stood in the entrance hall with the January evening dark through the great doors behind them and the castle warm and lit and full of noise ahead of them. They stood close, closer than the library table, closer than the corridor outside the Slytherin common room, in the specific proximity of people who have spent a day presenting a unified front and have not yet shifted out of that register. "Protected status," Daphne said. "The floor," Harry said. "The floor is more than we had in October." "Yes." He looked at her. "Hermione is going to want a full debrief." "She can have it tomorrow," Daphne said. He looked at her. "That's unusually lenient of you about information transfer." "I'm making exceptions for one evening," she said, with the dry quality he had come to love. He allowed himself to think that word in the privacy of his own head, where it had been accumulating evidence for months without him formally acknowledging it. "We spent 3 hours in a ministry room. I'm allowing one evening without documentation." "What do you want to do with the evening?" he said. She looked at him for a moment. The composure was present, but it was the soft version now, the version that had been her normal mode with him since November, the door left open version. "There's a room in the east wing," she said, "with a fireplace that actually works and a window that faces south. I found it in October and I have never told anyone about it." "Including Pansy?" "Especially Pansy," she said. He almost smiled. "Are you showing me your secret room, Daphne Greengrass?" "I'm choosing to share a location I have kept private," she said, with immense precision, "with the one person I have consistently chosen to share things with this year." She held his gaze. "That's different." "How is it different?" "Because showing implies I need your approval of it," she said. "Choosing to share implies I've already decided you're worth it." Harry looked at her for a long moment. The brand was resonant and warm and the entrance hall was quiet around them, and Daphne was watching him with her grey eyes and the composed expression that was completely transparent to him now, the open door, the warmth underneath, the thing she had stopped pretending wasn't there. "Lead the way," he said. The room in the east wing was exactly what she had described, a fireplace that worked, a south-facing window with a window seat wide enough for two, and the specific quality of quiet that certain rooms in old buildings develop when they have been left alone long enough to become themselves. Daphne lit the fire with a precise wand movement and sat in the window seat, and Harry sat beside her with the January dark pressing against the glass and the grounds white and still below them. They sat in silence for a while. Not the silence of people who have run out of things to say, but the silence of people who have been talking at high intensity all day and have arrived at a place where not talking is its own kind of communication. The fire was warm. The brand was warm. Outside, the first stars were appearing in the cold clear sky above the snow-covered grounds. "My father liked you," Daphne said. "I know. I liked him," he said. On the walk back to the gate, she paused. "He said you remind him of what he wanted to be before he learned to be careful." Harry turned to look at her. She was looking out the window, her profile clean and precise and entirely unguarded in the firelight. What did he mean by that? "He meant that he used to be direct," she said. Before he learned that directness in our world has consequences and that careful is safer. She was quiet for a moment. He chose careful. He doesn't regret it because careful kept his family whole. But he sees the version of himself that didn't choose careful when he looks at you. Harry sat with this. It was the kind of thing that was worth sitting with. Is that why you're careful? He said. She looked at him then. I'm careful because I was taught that warmth in Slytherin is a liability, she said. That composure protects you. That walls are useful. A pause. Those things are true. They're also incomplete. Incomplete. They're true in general, she said. They're incomplete in specific. She held his gaze. In specific, with specific people, walls protect you from the wrong things. Harry looked at her. At the gray eyes that had been reading around the edges of his composure since October and that he had been reading around the edges of since the same day. I've never tried to get past your walls, he said. I know. Something in her voice. That's why I stopped building them in your direction. The fire crackled. Outside, the grounds were still and white and very cold, and the castle around them was warm and full of other people living their own entirely separate evenings. The brand was resonant and thorough and deeply, utterly steady. Harry said, Daphne. She said, I know. He reached out and covered her hand with his, just the simple direct warmth of contact, and she turned her hand over and her fingers closed around his with the deliberate quality of someone making a conscious choice. They looked at each other in the firelight, two 11-year-olds who had spent a year being more capable and more prepared and more themselves than anyone had expected, and who had arrived, through research and hearings and ministry rooms and late-night corridors, at something that the old compact had been pointing toward all along. Not the destination. Not the full picture. But the choice, deliberate, mutual, made with full information by two people who saw each other clearly. The compact was right, Harry said. The compact was extremely smug about it, Daphne said, and he laughed, genuinely, freely, and she laughed too, quieter but real, and outside the snow was still and the stars were very bright and the brand on both their arms was warm as a coal at its center, unhurried and untroubled and patient as something that has always known how the story goes. Hermione got her debrief the next morning, comprehensive and detailed, with primary source documentation and a full account of Thorne's protected status declaration and the legal implications of the pre-framework classification. She listened to the whole thing with the focused attention of someone taking notes, asked 12 precise clarifying questions, and at the end looked at Harry with an expression that was both satisfied and slightly complicated. "You're happy," she said, as though happiness was a data point that required acknowledgement. "Yes," Harry said. "Good." She closed her notebook. "Now. There are 7 things we still don't know about the governing logic and I've been holding them until I had your full attention. Are you ready?" "Always," Harry said. She opened the notebook to a fresh page and began. In the weeks that followed, the world did what it always did, moved forward with the combination of the expected and the entirely surprising that characterized a life being lived rather than planned. The ministry's protected status declaration came through in writing in the second week of February, formal and stamped and dry as all official documents, and Gale added it to the file and sent copies to all relevant parties and wrote a brief accompanying letter to Lucius Malfoy's solicitor that Harry suspected was the legal equivalent of a very polished door closing. Lucius Malfoy did not attempt anything through the ministry again that term. Whether this was strategic retreat or the beginning of a longer reconsolidation was a question Harry held open and continued to hold open, because a man who went quiet for a month and a man who had genuinely stopped were not the same thing, and he was not going to make the mistake of treating them as such. Draco had been different since the hearing. Not warm, not friendly, still performing the family authority with the practiced ease of someone who does it too automatically to stop entirely. But the specific quality of his antagonism had changed. The edge of it was less sharp, less personal. He looked at Harry in the corridors sometimes with the complicated expression of someone who had said something true almost by accident and was still working out what to do with it. Harry left it alone. Some things needed time, and Draco's version of figuring things out was his own process, and Harry wasn't interested in forcing it. Quirrell continued to be nervous around Harry in a way that Harry had never fully explained, and which Vector, when he mentioned it in passing, received with a very particular expression that suggested she had her own thoughts and was not yet prepared to share them. There was more coming. Harry knew this with the complete certainty of someone who understands that resolved chapters are followed by new ones, that the things you have dealt with are not the only things, that the world is larger and more complicated than any single year of navigating it suggests. The Philosopher's Stone situation, which Harry had been peripherally aware of since the troll incident in October and had been slowly assembling evidence about, was a chapter that was not yet finished. He thought about this on a Thursday evening in late February, sitting across from Daphne in the library at their table, the fire going, both of them working. Her notes were spread before her with their characteristic precision. His were more sprawling, building outward from a central point in the way his thinking did. The brand was warm and steady, and the library was quiet, and Hermione was 3 chairs down doing something with a citation chain from Vector's monograph that she had found a problem in and was now solving with great focused energy. "What are you thinking about?" Daphne said, without looking up from her notes. "What comes next?" Harry said. "Specifically." "Quirrell," he said. "The 3rd floor corridor. Whatever Dumbledore has been guarding up there all year." She looked up now. Her eyes were focused and present and assessing. "You've been tracking that since October." "Yes. So have I." She set down her quill. "I have 7 observations and 1 conclusion." "Same time Thursday," he said, which meant something different now than it had in October. She looked at him with the open-door composure and the warmth she no longer spent energy hiding. "Same time Thursday," she said, and picked up her quill again. The brand was warm on both their arms, the governing logic's oldest rule, the structural certainty written into the substrate of magic itself, patient as stone and steady as a compass, pointing not north but forward, into everything that was still coming. Not a fairy tale. Not a contract. Not a role prepared before the curtain rose. A choice. Made deliberately, with full information, by 2 people who had spent a year learning to see each other clearly, and who had looked at what they saw and decided, separately and then together, yes. This one. Here. The fire burned low in the library grate. Outside, February was dark and cold and perfectly indifferent. The work on the table was real and ongoing and far from finished. They were ready for it.